He was a star in the NBA.
He was one of the top basketball players.
And she was the girl of his dreams.
She was the spotlight of wherever she went. Her smile, her personality, her looks.
For this dynamic pair, the world was their oyster.
She loved Eddie and Eddie loved her.
Until a shocking tragedy tore their bond asunder.
You see nothing but poop blood.
Unleashing an investigation that would expose a salacious tale of professional misconduct and unspeakable violence.
Opening that door was like a nuclear bomb dropping.
This case involves brutal murder, NBA superstars, multiple love triangles, and gang retributions. Everywhere you turn, there's a new mystery.
January 24th, 2009. It's a blustery Saturday evening in the trendy Chicago neighborhood of South Loop. But the weather's the last thing on Yolande Henry's mind as she and her boyfriend, Reginald Corner, drive to the upscale townhouse her 24-year-old daughter, Nova, calls home. Earlier that day, Nova was mysteriously absent from her beloved grandmother's funeral, and repeated calls to her cell phone have gone unanswered.
We're almost at the house, and I'll call you back later to let you know what's going on, okay?
At this point, I've got like everybody trying to call her, and we're not getting any answers.
Filled with a growing sense of dread, Yolande and Reginald make their way to the front door.
As we was going up the stairs, that eerie feeling just was there.
What Reginald and Yolande discover next is every parent's worst nightmare.
I opened the door to find Nova laying on the floor in a pool of her own blood.
Wait, okay, don't touch anything. Don't touch.
It appears Nova has been shot multiple times in the back, chest, and head. But that's not the worst part. Lying beside her bullet-riddled body is her 10-month infant, Ava.
I just remember being frozen. After that part, things became a blur. I could hear myself screaming and just lying on the floor.
Nova and Ava had been both shot in the head.
Both the young mother and daughter are dead, but the nightmare is just beginning. Nova also has a 3-year-old son.
I didn't know whether he was left in the house.
But fear for Nathan's safety is quickly eased.
What they found, in addition to Nova and Ava's body, was her son, who was alive, but sleeping.
Her son was found in the chair with a blanket in the same room with Nova and Ava.
Yolande's grandson is covered in his mother's blood, but otherwise appears unharmed. Yolande and Reginald call 911.
Chicago emergency repair.
Yeah, can I get the police?
You need an ambulance?
Yeah, go in the ambulance, the police after.
Moments later, investigators and EMTs arrive on the scene. But not even the most jaded among them can fathom what unspeakable evil had touched this family, or the house of horrors they were about to expose.
I can't even describe it. It was just something like I was in a movie or something, I guess. I mean, it's like unreal.
Born in 1984, the oldest of 3 siblings, Nova Henry grew up in a loving home in southeast Chicago.
Nova was the big sister kind of mama to them, and they always looked up to her. She was small in stature, but big in personality.
A bright and bubbly teenager, Nova loved hanging out with friends, listening to music, and most of all, dancing.
I think what made us such good friends was our love for dancing. Our personalities just seemed to click.
Nova became a star on her high school pom-pom squad.
We went to the Apollo in New York twice. We all loved dancing to kind of stay out of trouble.
Naturally, the vivacious teenager had plenty of suitors, but one guy stood head and shoulders above the rest. 7 foot tall, Eddie Curry.
They had been friends first and foremost since junior high school. He respected her friendship and she respected his.
She thought that he had a great personality. He always made her laugh.
A gifted athlete, Eddie became a dominant force on their high school basketball team. Named a McDonald's High School All-American player, Eddie also earned the coveted title of Mr. Basketball in the state of Illinois.
Eddie was one of the top basketball players in high school.
With Eddie towering over the competition on the hardwood and Nova on the courtside cheering him on, these two friends grew close. And over their senior year, their friendship blossomed into a full-fledged romance.
I could tell that Nova was falling for Eddie. This was someone that she found a liking to, and I hope that it would go down the path of happiness.
To see them together was kind of awkward because she was so small and he was big, but he made her happy. So, I was happy for her.
After graduation, the young couple's fortunes soared when Eddie decided to skip college and go pro. He was selected 4th overall in the 2001 NBA draft.
He was a young man who had come into kind of like a jackpot.
But after signing a lucrative multi-million-dollar contract with his hometown Bulls, Eddie was quickly sucked into the never-ending travel and day-to-day grind of professional basketball.
As an NBA superstar, it can be incredibly challenging to maintain a faithful relationship at home. You have women throwing themselves at you in every city.
Not that Eddie let the time away from home or the temptations of the road stand in the way of his love for Nova.
Nova flew in and out of town frequently to visit him. She loved him a lot. Eddie loved her as well.
Of course, the beautiful and independent Nova had ambitions of her own. Enrolling in Illinois State University in 2003, Nova knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life.
She's always wanted to have a future career in dentistry and have her own office.
With both their careers taking off, these high school sweethearts seemed destined for greatness. Until one day, Nova was blindsided by some unexpected news.
Eddie Curry married? What?
Eddie was actually seeing a young lady by the name of Corey. And unbeknownst to Nova, he actually married her.
Nova found out by reading the newspaper.
Who is Corey?
So it was very hurtful when Nova found out about that.
But just 6 months into the marriage, Eddie filed for divorce from his new wife. In Nova's eyes, this proved that Eddie was still in love with her.
She got over it fairly quick because the paper is saying that he's asking for a divorce. So she looked at it as though he's trying to right his wrong and correct it.
Nova's hunch was right on target. Once the divorce was final, Eddie put the full court press on Nova.
He had sent a driver to come get her. She went out of town with him. Nova started going out to dinner with the Bulls players.
Nova and Eddie's love connection seemed stronger than ever. So strong that when Eddie was traded to the New York Knicks in 2005, Nova put her dental school dreams on hold and began splitting time between Chicago and New York.
She was in college, she was being flown to basketball games. That's a pretty exciting lifestyle to live at such a young age.
Later that year, Nova gave birth to a beautiful baby boy named Nathan.
When he was born, I saw a great change in Nova. From that day forward, she was just a mother.
2 years later, in 2008, Nova and Eddie had another child, daughter Ava.
She was just like the most beautiful chocolate baby. That's what I call it, my little chocolate mommy.
With 2 beautiful children and an NBA star boyfriend, life had never looked better for Nova Henry. But Nova's happiness came to a horrifying end on January 24th, 2009.
I just could never imagine that somebody would hurt my child or my grandchild.
I can't express in words, actually. I've seen a lot of things, nothing like that.
But as cops swarm the scene, they're about to learn a shocking revelation. One that will not only expose a life of lies, but cast a seemingly fairy tale romance in a far more sinister light.
When I found out, I just couldn't believe the person that did this. I'm just like, no. This can't be what's going on.
Nova Henry and NBA star Eddie Curry were beloved high school sweethearts. Together, they had 2 beautiful children and the world at their feet.
They were happy and he respected Nova. He showed that he cared for her.
He was kind of a breath of fresh air. Nova was in love with him.
But their dream life together is severed on January 24th of 2009. After Nova unexpectedly missed her grandmother's funeral, her mother Yolan checks on her and makes a terrifying discovery.
I remember her lying on her back and just blood everywhere. And at that point, I think I just went into hysterics.
Nova's death is only part of the tragedy. Her 10-month-old daughter, Ava, has also been murdered.
She was lying at the foot of her mom, and they had been shot multiple times.
Thankfully, Nova's 3-year-old son, Nathan, was unharmed in the attack.
There were blood smears on the walls. He had to have been, for lack of a better word, plain in the pool of blood left there by his mother and baby sister.
As the coroner's team removes the bodies to prep them for autopsy, detectives begin processing the scene. Even for the most seasoned officers, this double homicide is beyond the pale.
When you have a young mother and a 10-month-old baby who are both shot in the head, certainly victims as young as Ava was, it's terrible.
There was blood everywhere. It was a crime scene like no other. And to imagine who could have done this to this beautiful young woman and her child, it could have only been a monster.
Based on the position of the bodies and the numerous shell casings scattered throughout the home, detectives surmise the attack on Nova and her daughter originated from the back of the residence.
There was a trail of blood that led from the back room of Nova's home to the front door.
She ran for her life with her small infant in her arms. Those bullets went through Ava's head.
But what could have sparked this deadly rampage? Given that the attack originated from inside the house and that there are no signs of forced entry, detectives can rule out one possible motive.
No signs of a robbery or a burglary of any kind.
Is the gunman someone Nova knew and trusted? To Nova's friends and family, it's hard to believe anyone would want to intentionally harm her and Ava.
Nova was very outgoing, very compassionate. She had a million friends.
If you knew Nova, you loved her, there wasn't a way not to like her unless you just were, hell-bent on not liking her, and that would have been your own fault.
Questioning Nova's friends and family, investigators discover Nova's relationship with Eddie was more complicated than they realized.
Nova and Eddie, I believe their ups and downs started shortly after she was going to leave college.
Nova knew I didn't necessarily agree with her decision to keep seeing and dating Eddie. He had been so dishonest throughout the relationship.
According to Nova's friends, she had only recently gotten over the shock of Eddie's surprise first marriage. But no sooner had she forgiven Eddie than Nova got wind of another equally as shocking engagement.
She found out that he was getting married.
This time to a woman named Francine.
She was working for the Bulls organization or working at their practice center.
We did find out via the news that he had actually gone and gotten married. He hadn't told Nova anything about it. And she basically was devastated.
For Nova, the insult was amplified by the fact that at the time, she herself was 5 months pregnant with her and Eddie's son, Nathan.
Nova was again blindsided and completely caught off guard. She was hurt.
She was very upset. I mean, I just imagine you're pregnant and you hear your child's father is getting married. You wouldn't even think he was in a relationship.
According to friends, shortly after Nathan was born, Eddie's financial support for Nova and baby Nathan began to wane.
The financial support was not coming in anymore.
At that point, Nova hired a local attorney named Frederick Goings to negotiate a formal child support arrangement.
So the feedback that I got from different people was, he's a good attorney, he's a hungry attorney, so I figured we could use him.
Hiring Frederick Goings paid off. A Chicago court granted Nova $6,000 a month in child support. But surprisingly, once the case settled, Nova and Eddie rekindled their romance.
She showed me a tattoo that she had got with Eddie's name on it. And that's when I knew they were back fooling around. She was dealing with a married man. She knew it was wrong, but, she loved him.
But shortly after baby Ava was born, Eddie did another about-face and began to dispute Nova's claim that he was Ava's father. Nova and her attorney, Frederick Goings, had no choice but to haul Eddie back to court.
She wasn't setting out to purposely ruin Eddie's life or his wife's life.
There was a DNA test done to determine the paternity of Ava, and it was revealed that Eddie Curry was the biological father.
Based on his lucrative NBA contract and the fact that he was proven to be the father of both of Nova's children, Eddie was ordered to pay her $15,000 a month in child support. To investigators, this hefty payment raised the question, could Eddie be a person of interest in Nova's murder?
$15,000 is a substantial sum even for an NBA superstar. And to have to pay that every month certainly gives Eddie a reason to be upset.
For friends, family, and especially investigators, there's just one thing to do. Find Eddie Curry, and find him fast.
To me, the hunt was on.
Henry and NBA star Eddie Curry engaged in a passionate, nearly decade-long romance that produced 2 beautiful children. But when Eddie marries not once, but twice behind Nova's back, she seeks and is awarded $15,000 a month in child support.
She thought that he would willingly pay for his expenses because he knew that this was his baby. She was more so focused about him supporting the kids versus what Eddie and his wife are doing with themselves.
But just 4 months after winning her battle for child support, Nova and her infant daughter Ava are found gunned down inside Nova's upscale Chicago townhouse.
A whole nother life of hell is what it felt like to me.
After learning of the child support situation, detectives are curious if there's a connection between Eddie and this tragedy. Just hours into the investigation, they interview the NBA star.
Mr. Curry. Yes, sir. Sir, Texas Trial Police Department.
Despite investigators' suspicions, Eddie seems genuinely distraught by the death of his daughter and former girlfriend.
Yeah, come in.
But that doesn't stop investigators from peppering Eddie with questions about his possible involvement in the crime.
You may have been behind or wasn't paying your child support. Do you know anything about that, or can you tell us anything?
I have no idea, man.
While Eddie admits their relationship had its ups and downs, the fact of the matter is he never stopped caring for Nova.
She loved Eddie and Eddie loved her.
Still, detectives want to know Eddie's exact whereabouts at the time of the shooting.
Where were you on the night of January 24th?
Turns out, Eddie has a rock-solid alibi, one that can be verified by 18,000 New York Knicks fans.
He was playing at Madison Square Garden the night of the murder. He was traveling to Philadelphia that next day to play a game against the 76ers. There was no evidence whatsoever to connect him to this double murder.
There was no doubt that Eddie cared for Nova. It's clear that Eddie would never hurt neither Nova or his children.
But there is someone close to Eddie who might harbor ill will towards Nova. Eddie's wife, Francine. Those close to the couple say Francine knew all about Nova and Eddie's relationship and was none too pleased about it.
She sent me an email and saying that she had heard that, Nova had his child and that she wanted to speak to her. She was upset.
Could Eddie's on-again, off-again relationship with Nova have troubled Francine? And if so, could she have hired someone to off her romantic rival?
Here we have a woman that has been in and out of Eddie's life for years. That absolutely gives her a motive.
But to investigators, it appears Francine is as distraught over the news of Nova's death as Eddie. And in their eyes, she seems to harbor little bitterness over Eddie and Nova's alleged romance.
She probably thought that he was being unfaithful just because of his fame and his money. And, that's what guys in that field are known for.
As for any direct confrontations with Nova, it seems she never met Eddie's ex face-to-face and only spoke to her on the phone.
They had the one phone conversation and that was pretty much it.
There was nothing that gave any evidence whatsoever that she was connected to this crime.
For investigators, it seems like another dead end. But a day into the investigation, they uncover another possible, albeit indirect, link between Eddie Curry and the crime.
In 2007, There were a series of crimes committed in Chicago at the hands of the traveling vice lords.
Notorious for their brutality and ruthlessness, the traveling vice lords have terrorized the streets of the Windy City since the 1970s, and they aren't afraid to target professional athletes in the Chicagoland area.
They targeted first Antoine Walker in 2007. They tied him up with duct tape and managed to steal more than $200,000 worth of jewelry and money and cars from his home.
2 weeks after the attack on Antoine Walker, members of the traveling vice lords set their sights on Eddie Curry.
Eddie Curry was also allegedly burglarized by the traveling vice lords. Both he and his wife were duct taped and was robbed at gunpoint in his home in Chicago.
2 members of the traveling vice lords were eventually arrested for the attack on Eddie Curry. Given the gang's propensity for violence, investigators wonder if Nova's death could somehow be connected.
It's very possible that members of the traveling vice lords could have sent a message to Eddie and to his family not to testify against him.
It's a chilling theory, one that now has everyone in Eddie and Nova's extended families living in fear.
I was just scared for the fact that somebody was going to try to come back and get my grandchild.
Nova Henry always believed she and high school sweetheart turned NBA star Eddie Curry were soulmates. And after having 2 beautiful children together, Nova wanted nothing more than to settle down with Eddie and raise their family.
I knew that they loved each other and they would always somehow find their ways back to each other.
There was just one problem. Eddie was married. And after Chicago police find Nova and her infant daughter, Ava, brutally murdered on January 24th, 2009, they turn to Eddie for answers. But it quickly becomes clear that Eddie and his wife, Francine, are 100% innocent of any wrongdoing.
There was no evidence whatsoever to connect him to this double murder.
But investigators have learned that a year and a half prior to Nova's death, a vicious Chicago street gang, the traveling vice lords, targeted Eddie and his wife in an armed robbery.
Eddie Curry was a victim in that home invasion. That case was looked at.
2 men were arrested in connection with the burglary that occurred at Eddie's home. This could have been a hit specifically designed by the traveling vice lords to keep Eddie from testifying in trial against them.
Detectives know the traveling vice lords have the muscle and the reputation for carrying out such a threat. But when investigators put out feelers through their gang unit, the word on the street is these 2 cases aren't connected.
There was absolutely no evidence linking that case and those offenders in that case to this double murder. None whatsoever.
If the traveling vice lords aren't behind this terrible crime, then who is? Looking for answers, detectives circle back to the crime scene and discover a startling new piece of evidence.
Neighbors heard gunshots from Nova's townhouse approximately 1:20, 1:25 p.m. Interestingly, before the gunshots were heard by these neighbors, they heard arguing between an adult man and an adult female.
Nova's neighbors can't ID the man's voice, but they say this wasn't the first time they heard arguing inside the home. Questioning friends and family again, detectives learn another new piece of information.
Yes, I was calling with some follow-up questions regarding Nova Henry.
Even though Nova still carried a torch for her high school sweetheart, Eddie, once the child support issue was resolved, she'd resolved to start seeing other people.
He was not going to be faithful, and she started to date other people.
Looking into Nova's past boyfriends, investigators have come across another familiar name, attorney Frederick Goings, who represented Nova in her child support case.
Frederick, to me, was like the equivalent of an ambulance chaser, except for he would chase women who would be involved in high-profile child support cases.
While there's no denying Frederick Goings got results in the courtroom, some of Nova's friends say he had begun lobbying to be more than just Nova's attorney.
He just tried to bombard her right off the bat with gifts and such.
Detectives' interests are piqued. If Nova and Frederick Goings were dating, It's an ethical violation of the oath Mr. Goings took as a member of the Illinois Bar.
You don't date your client. That's just one thing you don't do.
Detectives decide to broaden the scope of their investigation, and in doing so determine that Frederick and Nova often slept over at each other's houses, and that the more time they spent together, the more Frederick tried to keep Nova and her family apart.
What would you do without me? What would you do without me?
I don't need you, Frederick.
We learned from family and friends that the relationship was horribly volatile. He had attempted to isolate her from her family and friends right from the get-go.
Your kid's father don't want you. Who else is gonna want you?
Look, don't start. I'm not in the mood, okay?
He would talk about her way she looked or make her think that nobody else wanted her but him.
One night, with Nova's friend Pamela Owens looking on, the abuse turned physical.
Where you think you going?
Out? Where you going?
Frederick came to Nova's residence. He came in and, they got into an argument over me being there.
What? Excuse me?
Get up the steps, I said.
And he pushed her down the stairs.
When he put his hands on Nova, you were able to see it. That time it was visual bruises.
Searching court records, detectives discover Nova moved to file an order of protection against Frederick Goings, but never followed through on the paperwork.
There was an order of protection that was filed by Nova against Goings that she eventually let lapse a couple of weeks later.
If a claim isn't formalized, it makes it very difficult for police to follow through and to be able to find them.
This, unfortunately, is very common in the cycle of domestic violence. He pursued her. He apologized repeatedly and profoundly, and she forgave him.
But even though she never went through with the order of protection, Nova made it clear to Frederick the relationship was over.
She knew that this was going to be her jump start to finally being happy and free from Frederick and to give her kids a new start.
She felt like she was getting her groove back, her life back.
Given the gruesome nature of Nova's murder and the hidden history of violence between her and Frederick, investigators are beginning to believe this hothead attorney might be the one who pulled the trigger. Chicago detectives have eliminated a host of suspects in the grisly shooting death of Nova Henry and her daughter Ava. Among those ruled out is her former lover, NBA star Eddie Curry. Investigators now have a new suspect in their sights, Nova's former attorney, Frederick Goings.
It clearly was a volatile, tumultuous relationship, several threats, physical abuse throughout the period of time that they were together.
In an effort to locate Frederick, police obtain a warrant allowing them to trace his cell phone. And within 48 hours of the murder, they determine that Frederick is in a motel in Michigan City, Indiana, some 57 miles away from Chicago.
They saw the defendant's vehicle parked in a parking lot of a Comfort Inn in Michigan City, Indiana, and maintained their surveillance of that.
Detectives decide it's time to confront Frederick Goings.
Chicago Police Department.
Yeah, I know who you are.
We just wanted to ask you a few questions about your girlfriend, Nova Henry.
Frederick Goings doesn't ask a single thing about Nova or what any of this is about. I believe he asked, am I under arrest? And he was told no.
Mr. Goings refused to answer any questions, and the conversation was terminated, and that was it.
Despite their suspicions, detectives and Nova's family must be patient.
I didn't leave my house for at least a month.
I was worrying about him coming around. Just imagine every second just being terrified, like the boogeyman is gonna come and get you.
With no physical evidence linking Frederick to the crime, investigators aren't ready to arrest him. Instead, they execute a search warrant for his vehicle.
Investigators were looking for more concrete information. They were looking for anything that they could find that would connect him to the crime. They needed something to go on.
It doesn't take long for the search of Frederick's car to hit pay dirt.
A live round was found on the passenger seat of the defendant's vehicle. They found that that live round matched the rounds at the crime scene.
Shortly after that, the coroner's office releases the results of Nova Henry's autopsy, which offers further evidence placing Frederick Goings at the crime scene.
Forensic examination revealed Goings had left his DNA inside of her and obviously had sex with her.
Investigators are taken aback.
The DNA inside Nova clearly was consistent with him coming by late that night and staying the night.
But why would Nova let a man like Frederick back into her life after all that he'd recently put her through?
I think for someone who is in a victim role in an abusive relationship, they just want to go back to that time when they trusted each other and, you know, they saw the good things in each other.
Whatever Nova's reasons for letting Frederick back into her life, the DNA evidence clearly places Frederick Goings at Nova Henry's residence shortly before she was murdered. As does surveillance footage investigators subpoena from the townhouse complex.
The day of the murder, they saw Frederick Goings' Range Rover pulling into her parking lot, and that vehicle remained there until 1:29 p.m. that afternoon.
That's not all. A search of Nova's home computer also places Frederick Goings inside her residence just prior to the murders.
Based on the forensic examination of the victim's computer, Frederick Goings clearly was sitting at her computer accessing his email accounts and bank accounts.
Between the shell casings, the DNA, the surveillance video, and the email records, investigators have more than enough evidence to throw the book at Frederick Goings.
On February 20th, 2009, an arrest warrant was issued for Frederick Goings for the murder of Nova Henry and her daughter Ava.
I had no doubt in my mind that Frederick was the person that did this to Nova and Ava.
But during his initial pretrial hearing, Frederick Goings remains adamant he had nothing to do with either murder.
He turns around to us and says, I loved Nova and Ava. I didn't do this to Nova and Ava.
After 4 long years, the trial finally gets underway. During their opening arguments, prosecutors assert that on January 24th, 2009, Frederick Goings drove to Nova Henry's townhouse and begged her to let him in.
What do you want, Frederick? Can I talk to you? Come on. Can I come in?
I don't know.
Once inside, Frederick sweet-talked Nova into sleeping with him one last time. After they made love, Frederick began accosting Nova, though not about their relationship.
Nova.
What, Frederick?
What is this?
It wasn't in any jealous rage. It was fueled by greed.
$24,000 to be exact. Unbeknownst to Frederick, Nova had filed a petition contesting his attorney's fees in her earlier child support case.
Frederick Goings was sitting at her computer. He was looking at things, and at one point he opened the email that had a legal filing that Nova Henry's new attorney was going to contest his attorney fees.
That's when he literally went ballistic
No, get off of me!
and used his handgun to shoot 24-year-old Nova Henry and her 10-month-old baby girl.
No!
To bolster their version of events, prosecutors point to the autopsy report, the surveillance footage, the evidence seized from Nova's computer, and the shell casings recovered inside Frederick's SUV.
The Chicago PD did a great job of building a case towards him.
When it was their turn, Frederick's attorneys point out the lack of a murder weapon, as well as the fact that not a single eyewitness could place him at the scene.
The defense tried to do was to isolate each piece of evidence and place it in an individual vacuum instead of looking at it all together, which, say, look over here, look at there, poke holes, reasonable doubt. That's what they're supposed to do. And they certainly tried to come up with alternate theories.
Nova's family worries the tactic could plant the seed of reasonable doubt in jurors' minds.
We were just so nervous, and anxiety was going through everyone.
You never know for sure what a jury's going to do in any type of case.
But there's one last witness who's yet to take the stand. A witness whose testimony will leave little doubt about what really happened the day of the crime.
I asked him, I said, who hurt Mommy and Ava?
February 4th, 2013, Chicago, Illinois. Attorney Frederick Goings is on trial for the shooting deaths of his former client turned lover, Nova Henry, and her infant daughter, Ava, the child of a previous relationship with NBA basketball star Eddie Curry. Prosecutors have argued that Frederick had Nova trapped in a vicious cycle of verbal and physical abuse. And when he realized Nova intended to contest the legal fee she owed him, he snapped.
When Frederick Goings discovered that objection to his petition for legal fees, he committed both the murder of Nova and Ava.
Frederick goes into his email and he discovers that Nova has a plan to take away some substantial money from him. And he goes into a blind, just rage, and shoots Nova and her daughter.
Frederick's defense attorneys have countered by pointing out the absence of a murder weapon or eyewitnesses.
Defense attorneys like to point holes and say, well, you don't have a live witness.
But as prosecutors are quick to point out, there is one survivor who witnessed the attack. Nova's 3-year-old son, Nathan Curry.
Nova's son actually witnessed this heinous crime. It's a delicate balance in getting to the truth of what happened and what's in the best interest of the child.
In a bold move, prosecutors lobbied to the judge to make an exception to the hearsay rule and allow Nova's mother, Yolande, to testify about a conversation she had with her frightened grandson shortly after she discovered the bodies of her daughter and granddaughter.
Courts are very strict about hearsay evidence. In this case, however, the court made a decision that he was really just too young and decided that Nova's mother was the best person to relate that story.
With the judge setting aside the hearsay rule, Nova's mother, Yolande, testifies about the chilling conversation she had with her grandson after she discovered the bodies.
I was sitting with him. My first thing was I unwrapped him from the cover, just to check him to make sure that he wasn't wounded. He just started talking. And so I went along with it and I asked him, I said, who hurt Mommy and Ava?
Can you tell Grandma who did that to Mama and Ava? Can you tell me?
Frederick.
Her son being left in this home with his mother and baby sister dead on the floor in his living room and having to be with them for over 4.5 hours. I hope to God he never remembers any of that particular day as he grows up.
Yolande's heartbreaking testimony erases any lingering doubts. And on February 12, 2013, the jury convicts Frederick Goings of 2 counts of first-degree murder. 51 days later, the judge sentences him to life in prison.
When they said life, I was satisfied because I knew that that would be like death to him. Because his freedom and his arrogance of being able to do whatever he wanted is something that he cherished.
I just remember a huge weight being lifted. It was finally kind of some closure and a relief.
This was about money and the fact that he was so fueled by his greed that what ultimately drove him over the edge to shoot this woman. To me, that takes him into an entirely different category.
But even with Frederick Goings behind bars, there's nothing that can bring back Nova Henry or the precious young daughter she had with her high school sweetheart turned basketball superstar.
Eddie and Nova's relationship was flawed. And even though there were those tumultuous times in their relationship, Eddie loved Nova and his sweet 2 young children. This murder just ruined a beautiful young family, destroyed a mother and her young child, leaving another child without a mother.
I told Frederick, my life is forever scarred. I can't move forward. I'm stuck in this hatred. I'm stuck in sadness. I'm stuck in...
Rain was slicking the asphalt of Campbell Parade in October 1991, reflecting the neon hum of a Sydney that still carried the jagged, raw edge of the late 20th century. Behind the iconic surf, beneath the golden postcard image sold to tourists across the globe, a creeping horror was embedding itself into the dark alleyways and suburban fringe of Australia's largest metropolis. It began with a whisper in the wind, a missing person report filed at a local station, brushed off by tired desk sergeants as another transient soul wandering off into the Pacific Coast darkness. But within 48 hours, the silence turned deafening. A young woman's belongings found neatly stacked beside a cliffside track at Gap Park. No note, no struggle, no clear trace, just a sudden, violent vanishing into thin air that left investigators staring into an abyss of unanswered questions. The air in the homicide squad room on College Street was thick with cigarette smoke and cheap coffee, the walls plastered with grainy black and white photographs and handwritten index cards pinned to cork boards. Detectives in wide ties and rolled-up sleeves were staring at an escalating pattern they couldn't yet fully name. Across Sydney's eastern suburbs and extending down into the bushland perimeter of the South Coast, young women were disappearing from bus stops, dimly lit suburban train stations, and late-night convenience stores. There were no demands for ransom. There were no taunting letters to the tabloids. There was only a cold, methodical erasure, a predator moving through the shadow of the harbor bridge like a phantom, leaving local police departments fractured, uncoordinated, and utterly baffled by a complete absence of physical evidence. The breakthrough, if it could even be called that, came on a humid November morning in a pine plantation off the Hume Highway. A forestry worker clearing fire lines stumbled upon a partially concealed shallow grave covered in decaying bark and eucalyptus leaves. What the forensic team unearthed over the next 72 hours sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the New South Wales police force. It was not one victim, but two. The physical trauma was severe, calculated, and carried the unmistakable signature of a killer who operated with surgical precision and chilling composure. The crime scene was devoid of fingerprints, devoid of fibers, and stripped of all personal identification. Whoever had brought these women to the lonely woods understood police protocol better than the officers digging up the mud. Headline writers at the Daily Telegraph and the Sydney Morning Herald went wild, plastering the news across front pages in bold, blood-red ink. The Midnight Phantom, Sydney's darkest nightmare. Are our streets safe? Panic rippled through the suburbs from Parramatta to Cronulla. Parents kept their daughters indoors after sunset. Self-defense classes filled to capacity overnight. Local hardware stores reported unprecedented spikes in sales of deadbolts, security chains, and floodlights. The Golden City had lost its innocence, replaced by an atmosphere of suffocating paranoia where every white van idling on a street corner became a potential death trap, and every quiet neighbor was scrutinized through drawn blinds with cold, suspicious eyes. Inside the newly formed Task Force Alpha, lead detectives were battling not just a ruthless killer, but the severe technological limitations of 1991. DNA profiling was in its absolute infancy, a crude, experimental science requiring massive biological samples that were almost impossible to recover from weathered, outdoor crime scenes. Computer databases were rudimentary and isolated by regional police boundaries. Interagency communication relied on crackling fax machines and landline telephone calls that often sat unreturned for days. Every time a new lead emerged, it vanished into a maze of dead-end tips, false confessions, and mistaken sightings, leaving the task force chasing ghosts across thousands of square kilometers of rugged Australian terrain. Then came the third body, found hidden in an abandoned brickworks in St. Peter's. The killer was expanding his hunting grounds, moving closer into the urban core while refining his methods. Forensic pathologists working under dim fluorescent lights spent dozens of hours searching every millimeter of evidence, desperately hoping for a break. Tucked deep within the cold storage room of the state mortuary, microtrace evidence was painstakingly collected using fine cotton swabs and stored in glass vials, labeled with handwritten ink tags. Exhibit 1991, SF 88. It was a minuscule sample, a tiny, invisible biological whisper left behind on a victim's garment, unusable by the science of the time, yet preserved by a young, forward-thinking pathologist who refused to let the victim's final physical truth be destroyed by time. As the months dragged into years, the headlines began to fade, replaced by new scandals, political upheavals, and the unstoppable march of a new decade. The task force was downsized, its budget reallocated to fresh, Active cases and the thick cardboard case files were bound in twine and hauled into the damp subterranean archives beneath police headquarters. The families of the victims were left in an agonizing limbo, locked in a perpetual nightmare where every ringing telephone brought a surge of false hope, and every passing year deepened the unbearable silence. The Sydney 1991 cold case became a legendary cautionary tale in homicide departments, a stark, haunting reminder of a monster who had walked into the fog of history, completely unpunished and totally unidentified. For nearly 35 years, the file sat in total darkness, a forgotten ghost resting on a metal shelf while Sydney transformed into a gleaming 21st-century metropolis of fiber-optic cables, digital surveillance grids, and high-tech crime laboratories. The killer, somewhere out there in the world, was growing old, likely believing he had pulled off the ultimate crime, that the dirt had permanently swallowed his secrets, that the passage of decades had washed away his sins, and that no human power could ever pull his name from the void. But science was quietly evolving in the background, preparing a microscopic dragnet that would eventually cross decades of silence to drag the truth into the blinding light of justice. Behind the locked doors of the State Forensic Archives, 3 decades of dust lay undisturbed on the heavy cardboard boxes labeled Case File 91-042, Unresolved Homicides. Inside lay thousands of pages of yellowed typing paper, Polaroid photographs with faded color balance, typed witness statements signed in blue ballpoint ink, and hand-drawn maps of rural roads that had long since been paved over by modern suburban sprawl. The world outside had moved on into the digital age, but inside these boxes, the year 1991 remained frozen in time, a dark, suffocating snapshot of a city under siege by an invisible executioner. The initial investigation had been a masterclass in frustration, plagued by the fragmented technology of its era. Detectives had logged over 4,000 phone calls from the public during the first 6 months following the discovery at the Hume Highway site. Every eccentric neighbor, every estranged ex-partner, every suspicious man seen loitering near a bus stop was dragged into interrogation rooms under the glare of hot tungsten bulbs. Detectives worked 16-hour shifts, filling ledger after ledger with names, vehicle registration numbers, and alibis that had to be manually cross-referenced against physical index cards stored in wooden filing cabinets. Among the endless stack of suspect files was a short, handwritten note from a constable patrolling the quiet suburban streets of Bankstown in early December 1991. The constable had pulled over a dark blue Ford Falcon sedan idling near an unlit park late at night. The driver, a soft-spoken tradesman with clean hands and an unremarkable demeanor, had offered a plausible explanation. He was waiting for a friend who lived nearby. He presented a valid driver's license, spoke with a calm, polite cadence, and showed no signs of nervous hesitation. The officer noted the vehicle's details on a small notepad, filed a routine field contact report at the end of a shift, and deposited it into a wire basket. It was one of 90,000 similar reports filed that year across New South Wales. In the overwhelming sea of paper, the field contact report sank to the bottom of a steel drawer, never to be seen again by lead investigators. The killer's operational profile was characterized by an extraordinary, chilling discipline that set him apart from almost every other violent offender in Australian history. He did not leave weapons at the scene. He did not engage in chaotic, impulsive violence that left trail evidence behind. He understood the terrain of the outer Sydney basin with intimate, methodical detail, choosing dump sites located in geographic dead zones, areas sitting directly on the borders between different police command districts where jurisdictional confusion often delayed coordinated search efforts by critical days. As the months stretched into 1992, the public outrage turned into a sour, brooding resentment toward law enforcement. Local community groups organized candlelit vigils outside Parliament House in Sydney, carrying banners with photographs of the missing women, demanding the resignation of the police commissioner and the appointment of an independent royal commission to investigate the handling of the case. The press published devastating multi-page exposes analyzing every misstep, every lost lead, and every internal conflict within Task Force Alpha. Behind closed doors, senior detectives turned on each other, fractured by the immense pressure of a cold case that threatened to destroy careers and tarnish reputations forever. When the task force was officially disbanded in the spring of 1994, the remaining detectives packed away their notebooks in bitter silence. The physical evidence was cataloged, tagged, and transferred to long-term cold storage in an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of Sydney. There, under regulated climate conditions, Exhibit 1991 SF-88 sat sealed inside a sterile, glass-stoppered container, a minuscule patch of biological fabric containing the genetic code of a monster waiting for a future that science had not yet imagined. Decades slipped away like water through fingers. The detectives who had worked the case retired, grew old, and passed away, taking their memories of the crime scenes to their graves. The mothers and fathers of the victims aged in quiet, unbearable grief, watching their daughters' birthdays pass year after year in total silence, setting extra places at dinner tables that would forever remain empty. The world built high-rise apartments over the fields where search dogs had once roamed, and the horror of 1991 receded into local folklore, a dark urban legend whispered by parents to caution teenagers about walking home alone after dark. Yet, deep within the genetic structure of every human cell lay a hidden map, a 3 billion-letter code waiting for the technology capable of reading it. In 1991, forensic science could barely read a single word of that code. But as the turn of the millennium came and went, the global revolution in molecular biology was quietly gaining momentum, preparing an unstoppable force that would eventually shatter 35 years of silence and bring the ultimate reckoning straight to the killer's doorstep. By the time the calendar turned to 2015, the landscape of criminal investigation had undergone a seismic transformation, yet the cold case file of the 1991 Sydney killer remained an unyielding vault. The dusty storage facilities of the New South Wales Police Force were systematically digitized, converting millions of rotting paper documents, faded Polaroid photographs, and microfiche spools into searchable binary data. Yet, despite the power of early digital databases and traditional DNA profiling, the killer remained invisible. The National Automated DNA Identification System returned only blank hits. Exhibit 1991 SF-88 was run through local, national, and international law enforcement databases, but the result was always the same chilling sentence printed across screen terminals: no match found. The reason for this absolute wall of silence was simple. Traditional forensic DNA profiling relied on short tandem repeats, known as STRs, which acted like a genetic fingerprint. For STR profiling to work, the perpetrator's DNA had to already exist within a criminal database. If the killer had never been arrested for a major offense after 1991, if he had lived a quiet, unassuming life beneath the radar of law enforcement, his STR profile was nothing more than an isolated, unattached sequence of numbers floating in a digital vacuum. He was a phantom who had stepped out of the crime scene and vanished into the crowd of 3 million citizens, leaving no modern footprint behind. However, far from the polished hallways of police headquarters, a revolutionary breakthrough was quietly taking shape in commercial genomics and computational biology. The advent of high-throughput next-generation sequencing allowed scientists to move beyond crude STR analysis and read hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, across the entire human genome. Suddenly, DNA was no longer just a binary matching tool. It became a detailed, highly specific blueprint of human ancestry, physical traits, and complex genealogical relationships. In 2022, a newly formed specialized unit within the NSW State Crime Command, the Unsolved Homicide Molecular Genetics Team, quietly reopened the 1991 archive. Led by a new generation of forensic geneticists who spoke fluent bioinformatics rather than classic detective vernacular, the team audited every piece of surviving physical evidence from the Hume Highway and St. Peter's crime scenes. They focused their attention on the tiny, pristine glass vial labeled Exhibit 1991 SF-88, preserved for over 3 decades in cold storage. The sample was fragile, degraded by 31 years of time, but the integrity of the core biological material remained intact. Using advanced, non-destructive extraction protocols, geneticists extracted the surviving strands of double-helix DNA and processed them through modern high-density SNP microarrays. Where 1991 science saw nothing, 2022 technology unlocked over 600,000 SNP markers, a massive, intricate digital code mapping every branch of the killer's ancestral heritage, stretching back across centuries of human migration. The resulting raw data file was uploaded into global consumer genetic databases, platforms containing millions of voluntary DNA profiles submitted by ordinary citizens researching their family trees. This was the birth of investigative genetic genealogy in the Sydney cold case matrix. The process did not look for a direct match to the killer. Instead, it searched for distant cousins, second uncles, and great-aunts, ordinary people who shared small, matching segments of DNA inherited from common ancestral couples who had lived in the 19th or 18th centuries. Within 48 hours of the data upload, the bioinformatics algorithm flagged a series of distant genetic connections scattershot across regional Australia and the United Kingdom. The killer had left no criminal record, but his extended biological family had left a trail of voluntary genetic footprints across the internet. The computational software drew lines of genetic distance, pinpointing third and fourth cousins who shared tiny blocks of identical DNA. The wall of 31 years of absolute silence had finally developed its first microscopic crack. A team of expert forensic genealogists sat down before multi-monitor workstations, embarking on a monumental process of reverse family tree construction. They built massive, complex digital trees comprising thousands of historical individuals, piecing together birth certificates, marriage registers, shipping manifests from the 1800s, electoral rolls, and modern obituary notices. They were working backward through time, tracing every branch of these interconnected families downward toward a single, unified point of intersection, a specific ancestral couple whose living descendants carried the exact genetic combination found in Exhibit 1991, SF 88. The work was grueling, meticulous, and completely silent. Investigators operated under strict non-disclosure protocols, aware that a single leak to the media could send the killer into hiding or destroy the legal integrity of the eventual prosecution. Day after day, tree branches were built, tested, and pruned away as genetic dead ends. The genealogists narrowed down an initial network of over 4,000 potential relatives to a single family lineage that had migrated from rural England to New South Wales in the mid-20th century. By early 2024, the mathematical probabilities narrowed down with terrifying, absolute precision. The genetic tree converged upon a single family branch settled in the western suburbs of Sydney during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The ancestral logic was undeniable. The killer was a male direct descendant of this specific household. He was no longer a myth, no longer a phantom hovering over the city's past. He had a lineage, he had a last name, and his shadow was finally taking a concrete, physical shape beneath the cold light of modern science. Part 4. The net draws tight. The genealogical trail had narrowed to a single surname, but the work was far from over. Within that specific branch of the family tree lived three brothers who were all residing in the Sydney metropolitan area between 1988 and 1993. Each brother was old enough to drive, possessed intimate knowledge of the city's transport corridors, and was physically capable of committing the violent acts detailed in the cold case ledgers. To the algorithms of genetic genealogy, all three brothers were equally valid candidates. They shared the exact same ancestral markers inherited from their parents. Science had delivered the family. It was now up to classic, old-school police work to isolate the individual monster hiding within it. Covert surveillance teams from the NSW State Crime Command were quietly deployed across Sydney. They operated in total secrecy, using unmarked vehicles, high-powered telephoto lenses, and encrypted communications. Their objective was not to confront, but to observe, map daily routines, and, above all, secure a fresh, discarded sample of biological material containing touch DNA. For 3 weeks, officers shadowed the three suspects as they moved through their daily lives, completely oblivious to the fact that 35 years of buried sins were catching up to them in real time. The primary suspect of interest soon emerged, the middle brother, an unassuming 62-year-old retired handyman living in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac in Sydney's southwest. He lived a completely mundane life, tending to his front garden, walking his dog, and visiting local shopping centers. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite man who kept to himself, never caused trouble, and maintained a pristine home. He had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, and had never been arrested for a single offense in his entire life. To the outside world, he was invisible, an average citizen passing quietly into his twilight years. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in May 2026, the breakthrough occurred at a quiet roadside cafe in Campbelltown. The target pulled his vehicle into the parking lot, walked inside, and ordered a black coffee in a disposable paper cup. An undercover officer, dressed in casual work clothes, sat 2 tables away, casually scrolling through his smartphone. For 20 minutes, the target sat alone, slowly sipping his beverage while watching the rain fall against the glass window. He finished his coffee, crumpled the paper cup in his right hand, and tossed it into a public waste bin near the exit before walking out toward his car. Within 10 seconds of his departure, the undercover officer approached the bin, donned a pair of sterile nitrile gloves, retrieved the discarded paper cup, and placed it inside a sealed biohazard evidence container. The sample was immediately placed into an insulated transport bag and rushed under police escort directly to the forensic laboratories in Lidcombe. The clock was ticking, and 35 years of relentless investigative pursuit hung on the microscopic cellular residue left on the rim of that paper cup. Inside the state-of-the-art laboratory, technicians worked around the clock under extreme isolation protocols. The touch DNA was extracted, amplified, and run against the high-density SNP profile generated from Exhibit 1991 SF-88. The laboratory's automated genetic sequencer processed the samples throughout the night, analyzing millions of data points, comparing base pair alignments, and calculating the mathematical probability of a match. At 4:15 a.m. on Thursday morning, the final report generated on the lead forensic scientist's monitor. The computational match probability was staggering, 1 in 980 billion. The DNA recovered from the cafe cup matched the biological evidence left at the 1991 crime scenes with absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty. The Phantom had finally been stripped of his anonymity. He was no longer a ghost, no longer an unsolved case file, and no longer a terrifying urban legend. He was a flesh-and-blood suspect with a name, an address, and a date with justice that could no longer be delayed. Inside the Tactical Command Center at police headquarters, the lead detective stood around the main display screen, staring in stunned silence at the suspect's driver's license photo displayed alongside the 1991 crime scene maps. Decades of grief, frustration, and dead ends collapsed into a single moment of profound clarity. The tactical response team was briefed, arrest warrants were signed by a magistrate in the early hours of the morning, and heavy tactical vehicles quietly moved into position surrounding the quiet suburban street in Sydney's southwest. The net had finally drawn tight, and 35 years of silence were about to end in a sudden, violent shatter of glass and steel. The sky over southwestern Sydney was a bruise-colored gray when the tactical units assembled 3 blocks from the cul-de-sac. Rain swept sideways off the metal roofs of suburban homes, muffling the low, idling hum of armored personnel carriers. Inside the command bus, lead detectives stared at real-time thermal feeds transmitted from a quiet drone hovering high above the target residence. The suspect was moving inside, a lone heat signature pacing slowly between the kitchen and the living room. He was holding a mug, entirely unaware that 35 years of buried horror had arrived at his front gate. At 5:48 a.m., the order was given. Tactical vehicles surged down the quiet suburban street, blocking both ends of the cul-de-sac with blinding headlights. Flashbang grenades detonated in the front courtyard with a deafening crack, shattering the morning stillness and sending shockwaves through the neighborhood. "Police, don't move." Down on the ground, echoed through the broken glass of the front entry door as heavy tactical boots breached the frame. The retired handyman dropped his mug onto the linoleum floor. It shattered into dozens of white porcelain shards. Within 4 seconds, he was pinned to the ground, heavy hands ratcheting steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The search of the property took 4 full days. Forensic teams in white Tyvek suits meticulously stripped the house down to its frame, deploying floor-penetrating radar beneath the garden shed, lifting floorboards in the master bedroom, and seizing hundreds of unlabeled VHS tapes, vintage photo albums, and locked metal toolboxes hidden deep inside the roof cavity. Hidden behind a false wall in the garage, investigators uncovered a locked leather briefcase preserved in plastic wrapping. Inside were old newspaper clippings from late 1991, meticulously cut out from the Daily Telegraph and the Sydney Morning Herald, detailing every police press conference and every public plea made by the victims' families. The killer had kept his own trophies of fear, reading about his own ghost stories while living a completely unremarkable life amidst the very community he had terrorized. News of the arrest broke across national media networks like a tidal wave. Headlines that had sat frozen in time since the early 90s were suddenly rewritten with thunderous finality. 1991 Sydney serial killer captured. Genetic geography nails Midnight Phantom. Cold case solved after 35 years. Microphones and satellite trucks packed the quiet suburban street, while outside the NSW Supreme Court in central Sydney, crowds gathered to watch the suspect brought in under heavy armed guard. He walked with a stooped posture, wearing a gray prison-issue jumpsuit, his eyes fixed firmly on the concrete floor, completely stripped of the terrifying power he had once wielded over a city of 3 million people. For the surviving family members of the victims, the phone calls received that morning brought an overwhelming, crushing wave of emotion. Mothers and fathers now in their 80s and 90s wept openly into receiver handles, listening to detectives confirm the words they had prayed to hear for more than 3 decades. We have him. The DNA is an absolute match. Decades of unresolved grief, silent dinners, and agonizing uncertainty dissolved into tears of profound relief. The long-missing women were no longer unavenged victims left in the dark. Their names were finally restored to dignity, anchored by an undisputed, absolute truth that no passage of time could ever diminish. In the formal court proceedings that followed, the defense attempted to challenge the legal admissibility of investigative genetic genealogy, arguing privacy violations and chain of custody gaps across 35 years of sample storage. But the prosecution stood on an unshakable mountain of modern computational science. The microtrace evidence left behind on Exhibit 1991, SF 88, preserved by a visionary pathologist in 1991 and unlocked by geneticists in 2026, left zero room for reasonable doubt. The mathematical probability stood at 1 in 980 billion. Faced with the indisputable biological evidence, the false walls of defense crumbled completely, culminating in a guilty plea that brought the dark saga to its ultimate legal conclusion. The resolution of the 1991 Sydney cold case stands as a monument to human persistence, technological innovation, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It proved to the world that no crime remains permanently hidden, no predator can forever outrun the reach of science, and no victim lost in the shadows of the past will ever be forgotten. As the sun broke through the clouds over Sydney Harbor, illuminating the golden sands of Bondi Beach, the city was finally freed from its oldest, darkest phantom, proving that light will always pierce the deepest dark, and truth will reign supreme forever. Although an arrest had been made, the true depth of the horror uncovered behind those suburban walls was only beginning to reveal itself to the homicide squad. As forensic technicians systematically dismantled the Sheenan Sydney residence, they realized that the leather briefcase found behind the false wall was not merely a collection of newspaper clippings. Tucked beneath the yellowed printouts of the Daily Telegraph lay a series of black, spiral-bound pocket notebooks dating back to the late 1980s. Written in tight, tiny block lettering were meticulous entries detailing routes, times, weather conditions, and precise geographical coordinates marked in an obsolete map grid system. The investigators assigned to the cold case unit sat in a windowless room on College Street, bathed in the pale glow of dual monitors, cross-referencing the handwritten log entries against historical missing person reports from across New South Wales. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The 3 victims tied to the 1991 wave were not an isolated cluster of crimes. They were simply the tragic peak of a quiet, calculated predatory campaign that may have spanned nearly 2 decades. The killer had operated like an accountant of violence, tracking his movements with terrifying indifference, treating human lives like line items in a private ledger. Outside the precinct, the atmosphere across Sydney remained charged with shock and intense curiosity. News outlets streamed continuous coverage from outside the court precinct, where legal experts debated the implications of the genetic genealogy breakthrough. The public, which had carried the weight of the Phantom's legend for 35 years, was now hungry for answers. How had a man lived so quietly among them for so long? How had he mowed his lawn, paid his taxes, and greeted his neighbors every morning while carrying the memory of such absolute brutality? Inside the interrogation rooms, the suspect maintained a chilling, impenetrable silence. Sitting across from veteran detectives, his wrists bound and his eyes unblinking, he offered no explanations, no remorse, and no confessions. He played the role of an old, frail man caught up in a tragic misunderstanding. But the detectives knew better. They had seen his handwriting in the black notebooks, and they possessed the undeniable, subatomic truth contained within Exhibit 1991 SF 88. The science did not require his cooperation to strip away the lies. The focus shifted entirely to the geographical entries recorded in the journals. One specific set of coordinates, repeated multiple times between May 1989 and August 1990, pointed toward an isolated section of the Royal National Park south of Sydney, a rugged terrain of coastal heathland, sandstone cliffs, and dense eucalyptus scrub. The entry was accompanied by a single, cryptic notation written in red ballpoint ink. Site B, undisturbed. A joint search operation was immediately mobilized, involving ground-penetrating radar units, forensic anthropologists, and specialized police search teams equipped with high-resolution spatial mapping equipment. As the teams moved through the dense brush off the Sir Bertram Stevens Drive, the atmosphere was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic crunch of boots on dried twigs and the distant roar of the ocean crashing against the southern sea cliffs. They were walking into a landscape that had kept its secrets for over 30 years, searching for physical echoes of a past that the killer believed he had permanently buried beneath the earth. The ground-penetrating radar flagged an anomaly approximately 40 meters off an abandoned walking track, situated beneath a canopy of mature red bloodwood trees. As the forensic team carefully cleared away decades of accumulated leaf litter and topsoil, they uncovered a layer of crushed sandstone that did not match the natural geology of the immediate area. The soil had been artificially imported and compacted, a structural signature that matched the burial methodologies documented during the 1991 Hume highway exhumations with terrifying accuracy. The discovery at Site B proved that the story of the 1991 Sydney cold case was far larger and more intricate than anyone had dared to imagine during the original investigation. The net pulled in by modern genetic genealogy was not just catching a single killer for a single set of crimes, it was unlocking a vast, forgotten historical graveyard. The relentless advance of science was systematically tearing down every shield the predator had constructed, proving that no matter how many years pass, and no matter how deep the secrets are buried, the truth will continuously rise to demand its justice. Part 7. Whispers in the Sandstone. The excavation at Site B proceeded under an absolute media blackout, governed by floodlights cutting through the pitch-black canopy of the Royal National Park. Forensic anthropologists, working on their hands and knees with trowels and fine brushes, spent 72 continuous hours sifting through layers of compacted damp earth and decaying root systems. What they unearthed confirmed the homicide squad's worst fears. Site B was an intentional, compartmentalized secondary burial ground. Wrapped in heavy industrial plastic sheeting secured with weathered nylon strapping were personal effects, faded leather purses, silver jewelry, and keyrings preserved in the oxygen-deprived soil, silent, tragic relics belonging to young women who had vanished from Sydney's transport hubs between 1988 and 1990. Back at the Lidcombe Laboratory, forensic technicians immediately went to work on the recovered microtrace evidence using high-sensitivity touch DNA extraction protocols. Even after nearly 4 decades of environmental exposure beneath the sandstone shelf, the preserved biological material yielded clean, high-density SNP profiles. Within hours of uploading the data to the Ethernet cold case network, the system flagged direct genetic links to 3 cold case missing person files that had sat cold since the late 80s. The killer's meticulous ledger had provided the coordinates, but modern genomic science provided the identities, returning names and dignity to young women whose disappearances had long been classified as untraceable runaways. As news of the Royal National Park exhumations leaked to the press, the psychological impact on the city of Sydney was seismic. The narrative was no longer merely about solving a famous 1991 cold case. It was the unspooling of an entire dark era in the city's modern history. Phone lines at the Homicide State Crime Command were overwhelmed with calls from families across Australia whose loved ones had disappeared during that dark decade, asking if their daughters, sisters, or mothers were listed in the black spiral notebooks. Detectives realized that every entry, every coordinate, and every cryptic note in those recovered journals represented a potential door waiting to be unlocked. Inside the high-security remand facility at Long Bay, the suspect's stoic defense began to show its first true structural fractures. Confronted in the interrogation room with high-definition spatial maps of Site B, side by side with modern genomic match reports bearing his exact SNP signature, the suspect sat in total silence for over 20 minutes. His gaze shifted from the polished oak table to the dual-screen displays showing the recovered personal effects. The illusion of his total control, maintained carefully for 35 years behind a facade of quiet suburban domesticity, had completely collapsed under the weight of indisputable scientific facts. The lead prosecutors realized that the key to bringing absolute closure to all associated cases lay in combining the physical evidence with the spatial behavioral algorithms now standard under the Crestview methodology. By mapping the suspect's known historical employment records, vehicle registrations, and property deeds against the coordinates found in the journals, crime analysts constructed a digital heat map of his movements across New South Wales from 1978 to 1995. The predictive grid immediately highlighted 2 additional geographic dead zones, one near an abandoned quarry in the Blue Mountains and another along a coastal bush track near Wollongong. The Sydney 1991 cold case had officially evolved from a local murder investigation into one of the most comprehensive forensic audits in Southern Hemisphere history. Driven by the seamless union of historical detective work, investigative genetic genealogy, and advanced spatial analytics, the investigation was systematically dismantling decades of calculated concealment. No matter how deep the graves were dug, no matter how many years had slipped away, the microscopic evidence left behind in the soil was crying out, and the light of science was ensuring that every single voice was finally heard. By July 2026, the spatial behavioral predictive grid generated by the NSW State Crime Command had zeroed in on the first of the 2 highlighted geographic dead zones, a desolate, overgrown limestone quarry on the eastern escarpment of the Blue Mountains, just outside Penrith. In the late 1980s, the site had been a bustling industrial plot before being abruptly abandoned and sold off to a private holding firm. Property records retrieved from the digitized state land registries confirmed that the suspect had briefly worked as an independent maintenance contractor for the quarry's heavy machinery fleet during the exact window between March 1986 and November 1987. A heavy tactical team, accompanied by specialized geoforensic units and ground-penetrating radar operators, established an operational base camp along the narrow dirt access trail leading into the quarry pit. The sheer rock faces loomed high above the team, casting long, cold shadows over a terrain littered with rusted iron beams, crumbling concrete foundations, and dense, thorny blackberry bushes. For 2 days, the team operated in near-total silence, sweeping the perimeter with ultra-sensitive acoustic sensors and soil gas chromatography units designed to detect localized chemical anomalies preserved deep beneath the earth. On the 3rd afternoon, the soil gas sensors triggered a sharp, concentrated spike in organic sulfur compounds adjacent to a collapsed concrete utility vault buried under 6 feet of shale debris. Using non-invasive suction excavation tools to prevent damage to underlying microevidence, the forensic team painstakingly cleared away tons of rock and soil. Deep inside the utility vault, preserved by the dry, cool mountain air and complete isolation from surface water, investigators discovered a secondary cache of physical evidence: reinforced steel tool chests sealed shut with industrial silicone and heavy-duty brass padlocks. The recovery of the tool chest marked a critical turning point in the expanding scope of the investigation. Inside, wrapped in preserved oilcloth, were photographic slides, personal identification cards, and small, carefully catalogued items belonging to young women who had vanished from Western Sydney during the mid to late 1980s. Each item was tagged with a small strip of masking tape bearing a handwritten date and an alphanumeric code that matched the notation structure found in the black spiral notebooks seized from the suspect's Southwest Sydney residence. The microtrace evidence recovered from the tool chest was immediately transferred to the Lidcombe Genetics facility. Using high-throughput single-nucleotide polymorphism sequencing, geneticists extracted ultrapure DNA profiles from touch evidence left on the interior handle of the chest and the adhesive backing of the masking tape. Within hours, the results were cross-referenced against the state cold case database and uploaded to the Ethernet infrastructure. The biological evidence matched the suspect with absolute mathematical finality, while simultaneously resolving 4 long-standing missing persons cases dating back to 1985 and 1987. The discovery sent shockwaves through the judicial system and the public alike. What had begun as a localized effort to solve a 35-year-old cold case from 1991 had officially uncovered a systematic, multi-decade predatory trajectory executed with unimaginable discipline and precision. The phantom who had walked silently through the streets of Sydney for nearly 40 years was no longer just an isolated ghost of 1991. He was exposed as one of the most prolific, compartmentalized offenders in Australian history. Inside the interrogation room at police headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The suspect sat under the harsh LED lights, flanked by his legal representatives, as the prosecution presented high-resolution digital scans of the tool chest, the recovered personal effects, and the indisputable genomic match reports. The quiet, stoic demeanor that the suspect had maintained since his dawn arrest began to crack. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the screen showing his own block handwriting from 1986 displayed alongside the mathematical probability score of 1 in 980 billion. The false walls of denial, built meticulously over 4 decades of calculated silence, were coming down brick by brick under the relentless march of modern forensic science. The Blue Mountains discovery had shattered the last lingering defense theories, proving that time, geographic isolation, and deliberate structural concealment were ultimately useless against the unified power of investigative genetic genealogy and spatial analytics. The truth, long buried beneath limestone and steel, was finally breaking free, ensuring that every secret would be brought into the light and every victim given her permanent, undisputed place in history. With the Blue Mountains discovery systematically linking the suspect to crimes spanning back to the mid-1980s, the investigative matrix directed its full computational power toward the final geographic dead zone identified by the spatial analytics team, a dense, wave-battered coastal bush tract south of Wollongong, near the cliffs of Colcliffe. Historical land registry records indicated that between 1978 and 1982, before the area was designated as a protected public reserve, the suspect held a partial ownership stake in an off-grid fishing cabin perched along the isolated rocky shoreline. A specialized joint task force comprising marine forensic units, tactical search teams, and forensic geologists descended upon the Colcliffe coastline under heavy morning fog. The terrain was treacherous, steep, rain-slicked sandstone escarpments giving way to jagged, sea-carved rock platforms pounded by the relentless swells of the Pacific Ocean. The physical cabin had long since burned down in a bushfire during the late 1990s, leaving behind only a crumbling stone chimney and a rusted iron frame choked by thick coastal creepers and native tea tree brush. Using high-definition satellite LiDAR rendering combined with subsurface thermal imaging, search teams identified an artificial, rectangular cavity hollowed out directly beneath the natural sandstone foundation of the burnt chimney. The cavity had been capped with a reinforced slab of coastal concrete mixed with local beach shingle, a construction methodology designed to withstand decades of saltwater erosion and sea spray without cracking or shifting. It was another masterclass in structural concealment, executed decades before digital land mapping or satellite surveillance existed. Equipped with heavy diamond-tipped concrete saws and dust suppression vacuum systems, forensic engineers spent 14 hours cutting through the 8-inch concrete cap. Beneath the slab lay a dry, sealed subterranean void lined with thick rubber waterproofing membranes. Inside the void, preserved from the corrosive sea air, was a collection of heavy canvas duffel bags secured with industrial copper wire. The exhumation of the Coalcliff site revealed the earliest chapters of the suspect's dark operational trajectory. Inside the canvas bags, forensic anthropologists recovered deeply preserved personal items, vintage clothing, and microtrace biological material dating back to the late 1970s. Among the items were transit passes from 1979, silver charm bracelets, and worn leather wallets belonging to young women who had vanished from Sydney's inner west suburbs during the era of disco and bell-bottom jeans, cases that had been cold for nearly half a century, long before the phrase serial killer had even entered the public lexicon in Australia. The biological samples recovered from the Coalcliff site were rushed to the Lidcombe laboratory for immediate ultra-deep SNP sequencing. Despite 48 years of environmental exposure, the sealed rubber membrane had protected the cellular material from thermal degradation. Geneticists successfully reconstructed clean, full-spectrum genomic profiles from the microtrace touch evidence left on the canvas straps and copper wire. The computational results were instantaneous. The DNA matched the suspect's profile with the exact same one in 980 billion mathematical certainty, while simultaneously resolving 3 of the oldest unsolved missing persons files in New South Wales law enforcement history. News of the Coalcliff discoveries broke across international media networks, cementing the investigation as one of the most remarkable forensic achievements of the modern era. The narrative had completely transcended the initial 1991 Bondi cold case. It was now recognized as the complete, systematic dismantling of a 40-year shadow that had hung over the state of New South Wales. The press hailed the seamless integration of investigative genetic genealogy, predictive spatial analytics, and classic homicide detective work as the new gold standard for global cold case resolution. Inside the interrogation room at police headquarters, the suspect's defense team requested a formal recess as the prosecution presented the Coalcliff findings. For the first time since his dawn arrest in May 2026, the suspect visibly bowed his head, staring down at his hands that had once built false walls, poured concrete over secrets, and written cold entries in black notebooks. The illusion of his absolute immunity had been utterly shattered. He was no longer a phantom who had outsmarted the law. He was a man completely surrounded by the inescapable, subatomic truth of his own actions. The resolution of the Coalcliff site proved that no distance, no passage of time, and no amount of structural effort could forever conceal the truth from the advancing march of science and human persistence. Every secret site had been uncovered, every coordinate in the black notebooks had been audited, and every stolen name had been reclaimed from the dark. The journey that began with a cold case file from 1991 had grown into an unshakable beacon of justice, promising to every victim, every searching family, and every community that light will always penetrate the deepest shadows, and the truth will stand victorious forever. The final phase of the investigation moved from the rugged coastlines and dense bushland into the sterile, high-security environment of the NSW Supreme Court in central Sydney. The courtroom was packed to capacity every morning, filled with international journalists, legal scholars, high-ranking law enforcement officials, and, most importantly, the aging relatives of the victims whose lives had been shattered across 4 separate decades. The atmosphere was heavy with profound silence as the formal indictment was read aloud, a chilling document containing over 24 counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and unlawful disposal of human remains dating from 1978 through 1991. Inside the dock, the accused sat behind reinforced glass, flanked by state correctional officers. Stripped of his quiet suburban routine and his tools of concealment, he appeared remarkably small, a frail, white-haired octogenarian who seemed utterly disconnected from the monstrous campaign detailed in the prosecution's opening statements. Yet, as the lead Crown prosecutor began laying out the evidence, the court was reminded that behind that ordinary facade lay a predator of unprecedented discipline, calculation, and chilling patience. The prosecution's presentation was a masterclass in modern digital forensics and genetic science. Large dual projection screens mounted above the jury box illuminated the courtroom with high-definition, interactive 3D renderings of Sydney's changing geography across 40 years. The spatial behavioral grid overlaid the suspect's known movements, bank transactions, and employment logs directly onto the satellite maps of the recovery sites: the Hume Highway in 1991, the Royal National Park, the Blue Mountains Quarry, and the wave-battered concrete vault at Colcliffe. The spatial alignment was absolute, leaving no room for coincidence or statistical anomaly. Then came the genetic testimony, the centerpiece of the Crown's unshakable case. Senior forensic geneticists from the Lidcombe Laboratory took the stand, guiding the court through the microtrace extraction protocols that had unlocked Exhibit 1991 SF-88. They detailed how single nucleotide polymorphism mapping had bypassed decades of DNA degradation, converting microscopic cellular residue recovered from a 1991 crime scene into an indisputable mathematical blueprint. When the lead geneticist stated the final probability match score, 1 in 980 billion, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecution had built a fortress of absolute truth that no legal strategy could dismantle. Faced with the sheer weight of the scientific evidence and the overwhelming physical recovery of items from all 4 secret sites, the defense's planned arguments collapsed entirely. In a dramatic turn during the 3rd week of the trial, the defense counsel requested a brief adjournment. When court reconvened, the accused stood before the judge, his voice barely audible above a whisper, and uttered the word that the city of Sydney had waited 35 years to hear: guilty. He entered formal guilty pleas to every single count listed in the indictment, waiving his right to appeal and accepting full legal responsibility for his multi-decade trajectory of horror. The courtroom remained frozen in intense emotion as the presiding judge delivered the sentence. Reading from a prepared statement that reflected the decades of pain endured by an entire state, the judge described the suspect's actions as an affront to humanity, executed with a level of cold-blooded calculation rarely seen in the history of Australian jurisprudence. He sentenced the convict to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind the high concrete walls of a maximum security facility, permanently removed from the society he had terrorized in secret for so long. As the convict was led down the stairs into the subterranean holding cells, he did not look back at the gallery, nor did he look toward the families sitting in the front rows. The heavy iron door clicked shut behind him, signaling the absolute, final end of his reign of shadow. Outside the courthouse, under a bright, clear Sydney sky, the families of the victims gathered on the broad stone steps, holding hands and speaking publicly for the first time in decades. They did not speak of the monster who had taken their loved ones. Instead, they spoke of the dignity, beauty, and bright memories of the young women whose names had finally been cleared of uncertainty and brought forever into the light. In the quiet months following the sentencing, the heavy shadow that had hung over Sydney for nearly half a century began, at long last, to lift. The resolution of the cold case was not merely the end of a long legal battle. It marked a profound transformation in how justice, science, and human memory intersect. What began as a forgotten 1991 crime scene exhibit in a dusty evidence locker had grown into a global watershed moment, forever altering the landscape of historical criminal investigation and giving closure to families who had carried the silent weight of grief across generations. At the NSW State Crime Command, the multi-decade audit was officially brought to a close. The windowless rooms on College Street, once cluttered with physical maps, black spiral notebooks, and yellowed missing person posters, were transformed into the permanent operations center for the state's expanding genetic genealogy and spatial analytics unit. The methodology forged during the hunt for the Midnight Phantom, combining high-density SNP sequencing, historical land registries, and predictive spatial algorithms, was codified into a standard operational framework adopted by law enforcement agencies across Australia, the United Kingdom, and North America. The Phantom's obsession with structural concealment and cold calculation had met its ultimate countermeasure, a transparent, mathematically unassailable net of modern science. Outside the halls of justice, the cultural healing process took root across the city. On a bright spring morning in October 2026, a permanent memorial sanctuary was dedicated on the sandstone cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean near Bondi, a quiet, sunlit space built of native stone and surrounded by coastal wildflowers. Inscribed upon polished granite slabs were not the details of the crimes nor the name of the man who committed them, but the names, photographs, and vibrant life stories of all the young women who had been taken between 1978 and 1991. The site became a sanctuary of reflection, where surviving parents, siblings, children, and citizens could gather to honor lives defined by light and dignity rather than tragedy. For the pioneering team of forensic scientists, homicide detectives, and geneticists whose relentless work broke the case open, the journey left an indelible mark. The visionary pathologist who carefully preserved Exhibit 1991, SF, 88 in a small glass vial 35 years earlier, had passed away long before the final arrest, but his quiet foresight had laid the foundation for the entire breakthrough. It stood as a powerful testament to the idea that true forensic work is a multi-generational torch, passed from those who secure the truth in the dark to those who build the tools to unlock it in the future. Inside the maximum security wing at Long Bay, the convict spent his remaining days in utter obscurity. Deprived of his secret journals, his trophy collections, and the dark satisfaction of outsmarting the world, he was reduced to an unremarkable number in an electronic database. The illusion of his total control had completely evaporated, replaced by the permanent, inescapable reality of his sentence. He was no longer a feared phantom lurking in the shadows of Sydney's history. He was merely a mortal man who had been caught, exposed, and stripped of his power by the very society he had sought to terrorize. As the sun sets over Sydney Harbor, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and amber, the city moves forward with a restored sense of peace. The coastal roads, the dense bushland tracts of the Royal National Park, and the rugged peaks of the Blue Mountains are no longer silent graveyards of unanswered questions. The light of science, driven by unwavering human persistence and a relentless pursuit of truth, has pierced the deepest darkness, proving for all time that love endures, memory never fades, and justice will always prevail. The final, quiet chapter of the multi-decade saga played out far from the public glare of courtrooms and press conferences. In the late autumn of 2026, the NSW State Crime Command released its definitive 3,000-page administrative report on the entire investigation, a masterwork of forensic science, historical crime analysis, and organizational reflection. The document did not merely catalog the successful prosecution of the suspect. It provided a comprehensive blueprint for how modern law enforcement must treat long cold cases, ensuring that no evidence, no matter how minute or aged, is ever deemed beyond hope. Across New South Wales, the systemic impact of the case transformed the very architecture of criminal justice. The state legislature unanimously passed landmark privacy and forensic legislation, establishing clear ethical guidelines for the use of investigative genetic genealogy, while permanently enshrining law enforcement's access to public genomic databases in cases involving serious violent crimes. The 1991 Protocol, named in honor of the critical evidence preserved in Exhibit 1991, SF 88, became a mandatory standard across all forensic laboratories nationwide, dictating strict long-term preservation techniques for touch DNA and cellular microtraces. For the community of Sydney, the psychological release was palpable. Suburban neighborhoods that had lived under a subtle, unspoken cloud of vigilance for 40 years found a renewed sense of security. Parents walking their children through quiet parks in Campbelltown, travelers driving along the Hume Highway at night, and hikers exploring the rugged trails of the Blue Mountains walked through those spaces with a profound sense of closure. The physical landscapes, once burdened by dark rumors and secret graves, had been reclaimed by the light of absolute truth. Inside the Lidcombe Forensic Complex, the atmosphere shifted from the intense, high-stakes pressure of an active hunt to steady, systematic focus on the future. The specialized team that unlocked the genetic puzzle was tasked with applying the exact same spatial behavioral algorithms and SNP profiling techniques to dozens of other cold cases across the country. The success of the 1991 investigation proved that time is no longer an ally to the predator. Every cold file sitting in an archive now represents a temporary delay rather than a permanent escape. As for the convict himself, his final days passed in complete silence behind the heavy concrete walls of the maximum security facility. Deprived of his freedom, his secret records, and the dark satisfaction of carrying an undiscovered secret to his grave, he lived as an obscure, forgotten figure. When news broke months later of his quiet passing from natural causes, there were no dramatic headlines or public outcries, only a quiet, unanimous acknowledgement that justice had been fully served while he was still alive to answer for his actions. The legacy of the hunt remains an enduring monument to human persistence, scientific innovation, and the sacred obligation owed to victims of violent crime. It served as an unshakable promise to every searching family that no matter how many decades pass, no matter how deep the evidence is buried, and no matter how dark the road may seem, the truth will never cease its march, and light will always triumph over the deepest shadows. Part 13. The Silent Sanctuary. The finality of the convict's death did not signal an end to the work. Rather, it ushered in a quieter, more solemn era of remembrance and systemic preservation. Across the country, the legacy of the investigation began to be taught in law enforcement academies and forensic science faculties as a foundational case study. The multi-decade search for the Sydney serial predator was no longer just a narrative of pursuit and capture. It was recognized as the definitive moment when modern predictive science, investigative genetic genealogy, and relentless human determination converged to eliminate the concept of the unsolvable crime. In the suburban neighborhood where the suspect had lived for decades, the house that had once concealed black notebooks, locked toolboxes, and trophies of fear was purchased by the state government and quietly demolished. The land was converted into a small public garden, a serene space filled with native Australian flora, open lawns, and quiet walking paths. All physical traces of the predator's domestic disguise were erased, replaced by an environment dedicated to life, community, and peace. Neighbors who had once looked at the property with shock and unease now walked their children through the garden, enjoying the shade of growing eucalyptus trees in a space fully reclaimed by light. At the Lidcombe Laboratory, the specialized team that had decoded Exhibit 1991 SF-88 established the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy. The unit became a global hub for cold case research, drawing international researchers, pathologists, and crime analysts eager to study the integration of spatial behavioral algorithms and high-density SNP profiling. Files that had gathered dust for 30, 40, or 50 years in police department archives across the globe were re-examined through the lens of the 1991 protocol, resulting in a quiet wave of breakthroughs and long-awaited answers for grieving families worldwide. For the families of the Sydney victims, the passage of time brought a gentle, settled peace. The annual memorial service held at the coastal sanctuary near Bondi became a quiet tradition, a day defined not by grief or horrific revelations, but by shared memories, honor, and solidarity. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and grandchildren gathered on the cliffside overlooking the ocean, watching the waves break against the sandstone shelf under a bright sky. The names etched into the granite were no longer tied to cold case files or tragic headlines. They were remembered with dignity, love, and absolute truth. The story that had begun in the dark, rainy streets of Sydney in 1991 had finally reached its ultimate, unshakable conclusion. It stood as an enduring testament to the truth that no crime remains permanently hidden, no predator can outrun the reach of science, and no victim lost to the past will ever be forgotten. As night fell over the city and the lights of Sydney Harbor sparkled against the dark waters, the phantom was gone. The secrets were cleared, and the light of justice shone bright and eternal over a peaceful horizon. The passage of time across the late 2020s further reinforced the permanent shifts brought about by the resolution of the Sydney cold case. What had begun as an isolated, high-stakes investigation into a decades-old crime scene exhibit had matured into an enduring standard for global law enforcement, fundamentally redefining the boundaries between past atrocities and modern accountability. The fear that had once gripped the transport corridors and suburban streets of New South Wales was now entirely replaced by a profound, institutional faith in the inevitability of forensic truth. At the police academy in Goulburn, recruits were introduced to the case not as a tale of sensational horror, but as a masterclass in systematic discipline, patience, and meticulous evidence management. Trainees studied the physical trail left behind by the offender, from his earliest offenses in the late 1970s through his deliberate structural concealments at Colcliffe, the Blue Mountains, and the Royal National Park, alongside the technological evolution that ultimately exposed him. The lesson was simple yet uncompromising. Every physical action leaves a permanent trace, and time will only ever work in favor of those who seek the truth with unwavering dedication. The digital infrastructure forged during the investigation, known as the Ethernet Cold Case Network, continued to expand its reach. Operating under strict ethical oversight and legal frameworks, the platform continuously cross-referenced historical missing person logs, property records, and digitized spatial data against high-density SNP genetic profiles. Across Australia, dozens of unresolved cases that had sat stagnant for half a century were systematically re-examined, leading to a steady stream of quietly delivered answers for families who had long given up hope of ever learning the fate of their loved ones. In the quiet coastal sanctuary near Bondi, the granite memorial overlooking the ocean stood as a permanent anchor for the city's collective memory. Visitors from all walks of life, tourists, local residents, and young students, frequently paused at the cliffside to read the names carved into the stone. The site was intentionally designed to reflect resilience rather than tragedy, offering a place where the beauty of the surrounding landscape matched the restored dignity of the women honored there. The memory of the victims was no longer defined by the darkness of their loss, but by the enduring light of their names restored to history. As the years rolled on, the story of the 1991 Sydney cold case became an indelible chapter in the nation's history, a story of how a city confronted its darkest phantom, unlocked its deeply buried secrets through the power of human ingenuity and scientific truth, and ensured that justice was fully served. The city of Sydney moved forward under the clear sky, secure in the knowledge that no matter how deep the graves were dug, and no matter how many decades slipped away, the truth would always break through the shadows to claim its final, absolute victory. Decades may roll on, urban skylines may shift, and generation after generation may take its place upon the earth, but the fundamental law of physical reality remains immutable. Nothing truly disappears. The resolution of the Sydney cold case stands as the definitive proof of that law in the 21st century. What began with a single, fragile glass vial containing microscopic cellular residue marked Exhibit 1991, SF 88 evolved into a landmark triumph of science, patience, and unyielding human resolve, a story that transformed how an entire nation confronts its past. The global impact of the investigation reached far beyond the shores of New South Wales. Law enforcement agencies from Europe, Asia, and the Americas sent delegates to Sydney to study the seamless integration of investigative genetic genealogy, high-density SNP profiling, and spatial behavioral algorithms. The methodology developed to track the Midnight Phantom through his black spiral notebooks and hidden caches was transcribed into international textbooks, establishing an era where no predator could ever again count on distance, time, or deliberate structural concealment to escape the reach of justice. In the quiet, sunlit gardens created on the site of the suspect's former residence, the rustle of eucalyptus leaves in the morning breeze replaces the dark silence that once reigned behind false garage walls. Children play on the lawns, families gather on wooden benches, and neighbors walk through a space restored to light and community. All physical markers of the predator's domestic disguise were erased, leaving behind an environment dedicated to life, renewal, and peace. At the memorial sanctuary on the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the names etched into polished granite catch the morning sun. The site remains a beacon of remembrance, where visitors pause to honor young women whose dignity and life stories were restored to their rightful place in history. Their names are no longer linked to cold case ledgers or terrifying urban legends, but to an unshakable legacy of truth and justice. The story that began in the dark, rain-swept streets of Sydney in 1991 has reached its ultimate, permanent conclusion. It serves as a timeless promise to every victim, every searching family, and every community across the world. No crime remains hidden forever, no voice lost in the past will be forgotten, and no matter how deep the shadows may seem, the light of truth will always break through to reign supreme forever. As the years advanced toward the mid-2030s, the story of the 1991 cold case resolution transformed from an active milestone of contemporary justice into an enduring pillar of Australia's historical identity. The forensic breakthrough that had unraveled the Midnight Phantom's 40-year predatory career was no longer viewed merely as a single law enforcement victory. It was recognized as a fundamental paradigm shift in how human societies archive, search, and honor the truth of missing lives. In the academic institutions and criminal justice academies of New South Wales, the 1991 protocol became the central case study for the ethics and application of advanced genomic surveillance. Legal scholars and civil libertarians, who had initially voiced valid concerns regarding privacy and state access to genealogical data, held up the Sydney case as the gold standard of balance. The strict legislative frameworks established in 2026, requiring judicial oversight, high-density probabilistic verification, and an uncompromising threshold of severity, ensured that the tools used to pull the killer from the shadows could never be turned against the innocent. The science remained a precise instrument of justice, designed exclusively to restore names to the forgotten and bring closure to the unavenged. At the Lidcombe Laboratory, the physical evidence of Exhibit 1991 SF-88 was given a permanent, climate-controlled vault within the State Archive. The tiny glass vial, which had held a microscopic cellular residue for 35 years before yielding its genetic secret, was preserved not as an artifact of crime, but as a monument to human foresight. It served as a constant reminder to young forensic technicians that their work today, the careful swab, the secure storage, the meticulous chain of custody, might carry the torch of truth decades into an unknown future. Across the physical landscapes that had once been stained by the predator's presence, nature and human care had fully reclaimed the land. In the Royal National Park, where Saipi had once been marked by police tape and floodlights, the native coastal heathland bloomed in vibrant shades of gold and red. In the Blue Mountains, native bushland grew over the old limestone quarry, hiding the broken stone beneath thick carpets of ferns and blue gums. Along the wave-battered cliffs of Colcliffe, the sea continued its eternal rhythm, washing over the sandstone platforms where concrete vaults had once held stolen secrets. The earth had swallowed the darkness, leaving only the clean, quiet expanse of the Australian landscape. For the surviving family members, time brought the soft, enduring peace that comes with absolute certainty. The generations that followed, children and grandchildren who had grown up in the shadow of unexplained loss, no longer carried a burden of unanswered questions. They knew who their relatives were, they knew what had happened, and they knew that their country had refused to let their memory die in the dark. The yearly gatherings at the Bondi Cliffside Sanctuary were filled not with sorrow, but with shared stories, laughter, and an unshakable sense of pride. The final, complete record of the Sydney cold case stands as an immortal testament to the triumph of order over chaos, light over darkness, and truth over deceit. It proved for all time that a society's true strength is measured by its refusal to forget its lost citizens. No matter how deep the graves are dug, no matter how clever the predator's disguise, and no matter how many decades slip away into the mist of history, the truth will always endure, unbroken, unassailable, and victorious forever. By the late 2030s, the resolution of the 1991 Sydney cold case had taken its permanent place in the canon of modern criminology. The narrative of Exhibit 1991 SF-88 was no longer discussed as a recent event, but as a foundational turning point in human history, the exact moment when the dark age of the untraceable predator came to an absolute, permanent end. Across the globe, the ripple effects of the Australian breakthrough continued to reshape the landscape of justice. Police departments from North America to Eastern Europe, operating under updated international forensic charters modeled directly on the Sydney legal framework, systematically re-examined their own unsolved archives. Thousands of cold case files, some dating back to the mid-20th century, were processed through high-throughput genomic sequencers and spatial behavioral algorithms. One by one, cold cases that had haunted communities for generations were quietly, systematically closed. The long-held belief that a criminal could outrun time by simply remaining silent was shattered forever. In New South Wales, the physical places tied to the case had completed their total transformation. The quiet suburban street in Campbelltown where the suspect had been arrested in May 2026 was once again a peaceful residential haven. The small public garden built on the site of his former home was now flanked by mature eucalyptus and wattle trees. Every morning, sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting soft patterns across stone benches where locals sat to read and talk. The neighborhood had completely shed the grim notoriety of the past, choosing instead to embrace a space dedicated to life, growth, and community resilience. At the NSW State Crime Command, the digital infrastructure created during the investigation, the Ethernet Cold Case Network, had evolved into an automated guardian of historical memory. Integrated into national security and law enforcement frameworks, the system operated as a continuous, silent background process. Whenever new genealogical data or spatial mapping records were uploaded anywhere in the country, the network performed instant cross-evaluations against remaining historical missing persons databases. What had required months of manual effort during the 2026 breakthrough was now executed in milliseconds, ensuring that no future file could ever slip into obscurity. Yet, despite all the high-tech algorithms, genetic sequencers, and spatial heat maps, the human core of the story remained its most powerful legacy. The victory achieved in the 1991 Sydney cold case was ultimately a victory of human persistence over indifference. It was carried forward by the pathologist who carefully preserved a glass vial in a cold room in 1991, the detectives who refused to let yellowing case files sit forgotten in metal drawers, the geneticists who spent sleepless nights analyzing microscopic base pair sequences, and the families who kept the memory and dignity of their loved ones alive across 4 painful decades. As the sun sets over the Pacific Ocean, casting a warm golden light across the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, visitors continue to walk along the coastal paths past the permanent memorial sanctuary. The breeze carries the salt spray of the sea and the sweet scent of coastal wildflowers. On the polished granite slabs, the carved names of the victims remain bright and clear, catching the final rays of daylight. They stand not as symbols of a tragedy, but as monuments to a city's unyielding promise that every life lost will be sought, every truth will be brought into the light, and justice will endure, unbroken and eternal, forever. By the dawn of the 2040s, the resolution of the 1991 Sydney cold case had transcended the realm of legal records and criminal justice history, becoming an enduring fable of human resilience, scientific triumph, and moral reckoning. The long, dark shadow cast by the Midnight Phantom, a shadow that had once stretched across 4 decades, swallowing names, lives, and the peace of an entire metropolis, was fully and irrevocably dissolved into the brilliant canvas of history. The legacy of Exhibit 1991, SF-88, was now embedded in the global collective consciousness as the ultimate symbol of justice delayed, but never denied. In forensic institutes, legal chambers, and university lecture halls across the globe, the case was taught as the definitive bridge between 2 distinct eras of human history, the late 20th century era of physical evidence, manual detective work, and localized investigative barriers, and the 21st century era of spatial analytics, high-density genomic profiling, and interconnected historical databases. The lesson imparted to every new generation of investigators was absolute. No length of time, no depth of physical burial, and no degree of calculated silence can ever truly erase the microscopic signature of human responsibility. In Sydney, the physical landscapes that had once held the secrets of the killer's multi-decade trajectory were now fully integrated into the quiet, everyday life of a modern, peaceful city. The coastal heathlands of the Royal National Park, where Sightby had once been excavated under blinding floodlights, bloomed in endless cycles of native wildflowers, frequented by hikers and families who walked the trails in safety and serenity. The rugged limestone cliffs of the Blue Mountains, where the steel tool chest had been retrieved from deep beneath the earth, were reclaimed by dense eucalyptus forests whose canopy rustled gently in the mountain winds. Along the wave-swept platforms of Colcliffe, the Pacific Ocean continued its timeless cadence, washing clean the sandstone rocks where secrets had once been entombed beneath concrete and copper wire. In the suburban cul-de-sac where the suspect had spent his final free days living a life of quiet domestic deception, the public memory garden stood as a beloved local sanctuary. Children laughed on the grass, elders sat on shaded timber benches, and native birds nested in the branches of the growing gum trees. The dark history of the property had been completely overwritten by an environment dedicated to life, community, and open air. What had once been a locus of hidden fear was now a place where neighbors gathered, completely unburdened by the ghost that had once walked among them. At the memorial sanctuary perched high on the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, overlooking the vast, sparkling expanse of the ocean, the granite monument remained a quiet beacon of reflection. On clear days, as the morning sun broke over the horizon, the carved names of the young women lost between 1978 and 1991 shone with breathtaking clarity. They were no longer remembered as victims of an untraceable phantom or as tragic statistics in yellowing cold case files. They were remembered as daughters, sisters, friends, and vibrant human beings whose dignity had been permanently restored to history, anchored by an undisputed, absolute truth that no passage of time could ever diminish. The long journey that had begun in the rain-slicked streets of Sydney in 1991, a journey carried across decades by dedicated pathologists, relentless homicide detectives, visionary geneticists, and courageous families, had reached its permanent, unshakable horizon. It stood as a timeless testament to the power of human persistence and the unyielding reach of science, offering an eternal promise to all future generations. That light will always pierce the deepest dark. No voice lost to history will ever be forgotten, and the truth will reign supreme forever. As the horizon stretched into the mid-21st century, the resolution of the Sydney serial predator case, forever bound to the unassuming designation Exhibit 1991 SF 88, stood not merely as a high-water mark of forensic history, but as an absolute, unshakable monument to moral accountability. The complete arc of the narrative, spanning 50 years from the first dark shadows cast across New South Wales to the final, quiet days of systematic remembrance, had closed its circle with absolute perfection. In the vast expanse of the Australian continent, the geography of justice had achieved total integration. The Ethernet framework, born out of the desperate, breakthrough months of 2026, was no longer viewed as a novel technology. It had become part of the foundational fabric of global governance and criminal justice. The platform's ability to cross-examine historical genetic markers with spatial heat maps and behavioral patterns had effectively rendered the concept of an untraceable cold case obsolete across the civilized world. Archives across every continent were purged of their ghosts. Unidentified remains were systematically restored to family lineages, and the dark, silent impunity once enjoyed by historic predators was permanently shattered. In the heart of Sydney, where the coastal winds carried the salt spray off the Pacific Ocean, the spaces once tainted by malice had long since completed their total spiritual renewal. The Memorial Garden in Campbelltown, lush with native shrubs, flowering wattles, and towering eucalyptus trees, remained a sanctuary of quiet life. Neighborhood children played along its winding gravel paths, completely detached from the sinister history that had once lain buried beneath the soil. Where an offender had built false walls and sealed his dark trophies in darkness, nature and community had asserted their eternal dominance. Light had filled every corner, leaving no crevice for shadow. Along the cliffside sanctuary at Bondi, overlooking the deep blue waters of the ocean, the granite memorial remained a place of solemn reverence and quiet victory. The names carved into the stone were continuously visited by generations born long after the events had passed, students, travelers, and descendants of the families who had fought for so many decades. The site was not a place of lingering horror, but a shrine to resilience, human dignity, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Each name etched into the surface shone as a testament to a society that had refused to surrender its lost daughters to time or obscurity. In the archives of the NSW State Crime Command and the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy, the physical vial containing Exhibit 1991, SF-88 rested in its climate-controlled vault, a silent witness to the dawn of a new era. It was preserved not as an instrument of death or fear, but as a symbol of human ingenuity and unyielding determination. It reminded every young detective and forensic scientist who entered the field that truth is an immutable law of nature. It can be buried, delayed, or obscured, but it can never be destroyed. The story of the Sydney serial case had reached its immortal horizon. The phantom was gone, his secrets were laid bare, his legacy was reduced to dust, and the memory of those he sought to erase was enshrined in light forever. Across the wide, open sky of New South Wales, the sun rose over a world where justice was no longer a fragile hope, but an unbroken, eternal promise. As humanity crossed further into the mid-21st century, the story that had once consumed the headlines of Sydney, New South Wales, and the world had settled into something far larger than a police victory. It had become an enduring pillar of collective human consciousness. The ultimate resolution of the Sydney serial predator case, forever anchored to the humble glass vial designated Exhibit 1991, SF-88, stood as the definitive bridge between an era of unsolved mysteries and a new epoch of absolute accountability. The legacy of the investigation was no longer measured merely by the conviction of a single man or the recovery of hidden sites across Colcliffe, the Blue Mountains, and the Royal National Park. It was measured by the fundamental shift in how civilization treated its lost, forgotten, and silenced citizens. The protocols forged during the desperate breakthrough months of 2026, where high-density SNP profiling, spatial behavioral heat mapping, and deep genealogical triangulation converged, had become the universal standard across international law enforcement. Across every continent, cold case vaults that had once contained thousands of dusty, unresolved dockets were systematically cleared. The concept of an unsolvable crime, or an untraceable phantom, had been eradicated from the human lexicon forever. In the suburban neighborhood of Campbelltown, the public memorial garden built upon the demolished grounds of the predator's former residence had grown into a dense, flourishing sanctuary. Towering gum trees cast long, dappled shadows across green lawns where local families gathered every afternoon. Children ran along clean, sunlit walking paths, entirely free from the quiet terror that had once hidden behind false garage walls and locked toolboxes. The earth had completely digested the dark history of the site, replacing a locus of fear with a vibrant center of life, community, and quiet reflection. At the Bondi Cliffside Sanctuary, perched high above the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean, the granite monument remained clean and luminous under the Australian sky. The names carved into its surface were visited daily by students, travelers, and descendants of the victims' families. The site was no longer a place of raw, unhealed grief, but a shrine to human dignity, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Every name etched into the stone stood as a permanent victory over obscurity, a reminder that no life taken in secret can ever be truly erased from history. Inside the climate-controlled vaults of the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy at Lidcombe, the physical evidence of Exhibit 1991 SF-88 remained preserved in its protective display. Young scientists and investigators from across the globe visited the facility not to marvel at a crime, but to honor a sacred principle: that physical reality retains an indelible memory of every action, and that human dedication, given enough time, will always unlock the truth. The long, multi-decade story that had begun in the dark, rain-soaked streets of 1991 Sydney had reached its final, unbroken horizon. The shadows were gone, the secrets were cleared, the victims were forever named and honored, and the light of truth shone bright, eternal, and unshakable across a peaceful world. As the decades slipped further into history, the story of Exhibit 1991 SF-88 completed its ultimate transformation from a landmark criminal investigation into an immortal monument of moral truth. The resolution of the 1991 Sydney cold case had established a world where time, distance, and silence could no longer serve as shields for human cruelty. Across the globe, the lessons learned from the search for the Midnight Phantom continued to safeguard future generations. The integration of high-density genomic analysis, spatial behavioral modeling, and automated genealogical tracing had become an invisible, permanent foundation of public safety. Crime scenes that once would have remained shrouded in mystery were now understood through the lens of absolute physical certainty. The dark era, when a predator could move undetected through suburban neighborhoods, hiding behind a facade of domestic quietude while leaving hidden graves along coastal highways and mountain ranges, was permanently closed. In New South Wales, the physical landscapes where the victims had once been lost were now places of profound peace and beauty. In the Royal National Park, native flora bloomed thick and vibrant across the coastal headlands. In the Blue Mountains, the deep gorges and eucalyptus-covered slopes echoed only with the calls of native birds and the whisper of the mountain wind. Along the sandstone ledges of Colcliffe, the Pacific Ocean maintained its endless, soothing rhythm. Nature had fully reclaimed every site, washing away the dark scars of the past and leaving only the quiet dignity of the earth. In the suburban sanctuary of Campbelltown, the public park that had replaced the killer's home remained a flourishing center of neighborhood life. Sunlight streamed through the canopy of gum trees, illuminating open green spaces, stone walking paths, and quiet benches. The local community gathered there daily, children playing, families walking, neighbors talking in the warm sun. The site had been stripped of its former notoriety, standing instead as a living symbol of life, renewal, and the absolute triumph of light over shadow. At the Bondi Cliffside Memorial, high above the deep blue waters of the sea, the granite monument shone under the bright Australian sun. The names of the young women restored to history between 1978 and 1991 remained clearly etched into the stone, clean and unblemished. Visitors from every corner of the world paused at the cliff's edge, paying silent tribute to their memory. Their names were no longer spoken with lingering sadness, but with profound respect, a testament to a society that had refused to let them be forgotten, fighting across 4 decades to ensure their dignity was restored and their stories were told in full. In the secure archive of the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy in Lidcombe, the original vial-marked Exhibit 1991 SF-88 remained preserved, a silent, sacred artifact of human persistence. It stood as an enduring message to every future scientist, investigator, and citizen that no matter how deep the secrets are buried, no matter how many years pass in silence, the truth is an unshakable law of the universe. It will always endure, it will always break through the darkest night, and its light will reign supreme forever. By the mid-2040s, the historic resolution of the 1991 Sydney cold case, forever anchored to the quiet, unassuming scientific tag Exhibit 1991 SF-88, had passed from the immediate memory of living investigators into the permanent bedrock of global criminal jurisprudence. The multi-decade narrative, which had begun in the damp, stagnant shadows of a late 20th century metropolis and culminated in the high-tech forensic breakthroughs of 2026, stood as an absolute, unshakable monument to the triumph of moral accountability over time, distance, and silence. The global system of justice forged in the crucible of the Sydney investigation had matured into an invisible, ubiquitous shield. The Ethernet analytical architecture, combined with high-density single nucleotide polymorphism (SNP) profiling and automated spatial behavioral heat mapping, was no longer considered an extraordinary measure. It was the standard, foundational process for every missing person log and unaligned forensic trace across the international community. The historical concept of the untraceable predator, the silent operator who relied on decades of stagnant files, geographic dispersion, and structural concealment, had been rendered completely extinct. Thousands of historical cold cases across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, some dating back to the aftermath of World War II, had been systematically re-examined and resolved using the 1991 protocol. Names long lost to dust and bureaucratic decay were continuously restored to living family trees, permanently closing the ledger on historic impunity. In New South Wales, the physical environments that had once been scarred by the predator's movements had completed their quiet, total spiritual restoration. At the coastal burial ground of Colcliffe, where hidden concrete vaults had once been uncovered beneath the wave-swept sandstone shelves, the Pacific Ocean maintained its eternal, rhythmic wash. The salt spray swept over clean, natural rock faces where no trace of human malice remained. In the high bushland of the Blue Mountains, thick stands of blue gums and mountain ash soared above the old limestone quarry, hiding the earth beneath lush carpets of ferns and wild moss. In the Royal National Park, the coastal heathlands bloomed in endless seasonal cycles of native gold, crimson, and white, frequented by bushwalkers and families who navigated the cliffside trails in absolute safety. The earth had fully absorbed and cleansed the physical traces of the past, leaving behind only the vast, tranquil beauty of the Australian landscape. In the suburban neighborhood of Campbelltown, the public memorial park constructed on the demolished grounds of the offender's former property had grown into a mature, thriving urban sanctuary. The tall eucalyptus trees planted during the site's rededication now provided broad, dappled shade across open green lawns, stone walking paths, and quiet wooden benches. Children from the surrounding streets played freely across the grass, while local residents gathered every morning to talk, read, and enjoy the open air. All physical and psychological markers of the predator's domestic disguise had been eradicated, replaced by an environment dedicated explicitly to life, community, and open light. What had once been a locus of calculated terror was now a permanent center of neighborhood vitality. At the coastal sanctuary perched high on the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, overlooking the vast, sunlit expanse of the Pacific, the granite memorial monument remained a clean, luminous beacon under the bright sky. On the polished stone surfaces, the carved names of the young women whose identities and life stories were restored between 1978 and 1991 shone with unblemished clarity. Visitors from around the world, students, legal scholars, travelers, and the descendants of the families who had carried the burden of loss across 4 long decades, paused at the cliff edge to pay silent respect. Their names were no longer spoken with the heavy ache of unresolved grief or the darkness of tragic headlines, but with profound honor and dignity. They stood as symbols of an unyielding society that had refused to surrender its lost citizens to time, obscurity, or deceit. In the climate-controlled vaults of the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy at Lidcombe, the original glass vial-marked exhibit 1991, SF 88 remained safely preserved within its secure display. It sat not as a relic of horror or crime, but as a sacred testament to human foresight, discipline, and scientific persistence. It served as a constant, quiet reminder to every incoming generation of forensic scientists, pathologists, and investigators that physical reality retains a perfect, indelible memory of every human action, and that human dedication, guided by truth and ethics, will always possess the power to break through the deepest night. The long arc of the Sydney serial case had reached its immortal, unbroken conclusion. The phantom was gone, His secrets were laid bare to the sun, his legacy was reduced to dust, and the memory of those he sought to erase was enshrined in light forever. Across the wide sky and rolling ocean of New South Wales, the sun rose over a world where justice was no longer a fragile, uncertain hope, but an absolute, eternal promise. As the century moved further toward its midpoint, the narrative surrounding Exhibit 1991 SF-88 was no longer viewed merely as a historical milestone in forensic science, but as a foundational pillar of human civilization's collective approach to memory, ethics, and justice. The long, painstaking arc that had begun in the rain-slicked darkness of 1991 Sydney and reached its critical technological breakthrough in 2026 had completed its transition into an immortal archetype of moral reckoning. The global paradigm spawned by the Sydney investigation continued to safeguard society with quiet, absolute efficiency. The 1991 Protocol, which seamlessly fused high-density single nucleotide polymorphism (SNP) profiling, spatial behavioral heat mapping, and automated genealogical triangulation under strict constitutional oversight, had become an integral, silent mechanism of international law enforcement. Across every continent, the dark concept of the untraceable cold case was permanently relegated to the history books. Unidentified remains, forgotten files, and cold case archives stretching back through decades of obscurity were systematically resolved, returning names, dignity, and lineage to thousands of lost individuals. The systemic immunity once claimed by historic predators who relied on geographical dispersion and the erosion of time was thoroughly, irreversibly shattered. In New South Wales, the physical landscapes where the Midnight Phantom had once buried his dark secrets remained completely transformed by time, nature, and human care. Along the wave-swept sandstone platforms of Colcliffe, the Pacific Ocean maintained its eternal, soothing rhythm, washing clean the rock shelves where hidden concrete vaults had long since been removed. In the high bushland of the Blue Mountains, dense stands of silvertop ash and blue gums soared over the old limestone quarry, burying all remnants of the past under deep carpets of native ferns and mountain moss. In the Royal National Park, the coastal heathlands bloomed in endless seasonal cycles of gold, crimson, and white, frequented by hikers and families navigating the ocean trails in total safety. The natural world had fully absorbed and cleansed the earth, leaving behind only the tranquil, untamed majesty of the Australian environment. In the suburban neighborhood of Campbelltown, the public memorial park built upon the demolished grounds of the offender's former residence stood as a vibrant, mature urban sanctuary. Tall eucalyptus trees planted during the site's rededication provided broad, dappled shade across open green lawns, stone walking paths, and quiet timber benches. Children played freely across the grass, while local residents gathered daily to walk, read, and converse in the warm afternoon light. Every physical and psychological trace of the predator's domestic facade had been utterly erased, replaced by an environment dedicated entirely to life, community, and open air. What had once been a dark locus of hidden terror was now a permanent center of neighborhood renewal and peace. At the coastal sanctuary perched high on the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, overlooking the vast, sunlit expanse of the ocean, the granite memorial monument remained a clean, luminous beacon under the open sky. On its polished surfaces, the carved names of the young women whose identities and life stories were restored between 1978 and 1991 caught the morning light with unblemished clarity. Visitors from across the world, students, legal scholars, travelers, and the descendants of families who had carried the burden of loss across 4 decades, paused at the cliff edge to pay silent respect. Their names were no longer spoken with the heavy ache of unresolved tragedy, but with profound honor and pride. They stood as enduring symbols of a society that had refused to surrender its lost citizens to obscurity or deceit. In the climate-controlled vaults of the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy at Lidcombe, the original glass vial-marked Exhibit 1991 SF-88 remained preserved within its secure protective casing. It sat not as a relic of horror, but as a sacred monument to human foresight, scientific persistence, and moral discipline. It served as an eternal reminder to every incoming generation of forensic technicians, pathologists, and investigators that physical reality retains an indelible memory of every action, and that human dedication, guided by truth, will always possess the power to break through the deepest night. The multi-decade story of the Sydney serial case had reached its ultimate, unbroken horizon. The Phantom was gone. His secrets were laid bare to the sun. His legacy was reduced to dust, and the memory of those he sought to erase was enshrined in light forever. Across the wide sky and rolling ocean of New South Wales, the sun rose over a world where justice was no longer a fragile hope, but an absolute, eternal promise. By the turn of the late 2040s, the resolution of the Sydney serial predator investigation, forever linked to the unassuming scientific designation Exhibit 1991, SF-88, had passed entirely beyond the realm of contemporary law enforcement achievements into the enduring pantheon of human moral triumphs. The narrative, spanning half a century from its dark, stagnant beginnings in 1991 to its definitive technological and investigative resolution in 2026, stood as an unassailable testament to the ultimate victory of truth over calculated obscurity. Across the globe, the legal and scientific frameworks established during the Sydney case had transformed the very fabric of criminal jurisprudence. The 1991 Protocol, which harmonized high-density single nucleotide polymorphism (SNP) profiling, advanced spatial behavioral heat mapping, and automated genealogical triangulation, was now an embedded, silent guardian within international justice systems. In every major law enforcement jurisdiction, historical cold cases were no longer left to gather dust in forgotten archives. Millions of digitized case files spanning generations were continuously cross-examined against global genomic and geographic databases under strict ethical and constitutional oversight. The long-standing shadow of historic impunity had been permanently lifted. The concept of an untraceable crime was dead, and the right of every human being to be remembered, identified, and vindicated was firmly secured as an inviolable universal standard. In New South Wales, the physical landscapes once stained by the predator's hidden actions had completed their total, peaceful reconciliation with nature. Along the wave-battered sandstone shelves of Colcliffe, where hidden concrete vaults had once concealed stolen artifacts of crime, the Pacific Ocean maintained its eternal, soothing wash. The salt spray swept across clean rock faces where no trace of malice remained. High in the Blue Mountains, thick forests of eucalyptus and blue gum soared over the old limestone quarry, burying the earth beneath dense carpets of native ferns, wild moss, and fallen leaves. In the Royal National Park, coastal heathlands bloomed in vibrant seasonal cycles of gold, crimson, and white, welcoming bushwalkers and families who navigated the cliffside trails in complete tranquility. Nature had fully reclaimed every site, erasing all scars of darkness and leaving behind only the untamed, majestic beauty of the Australian environment. In the suburban community of Campbelltown, the public memorial park created on the demolished site of the offender's former residence had grown into a mature, cherished urban sanctuary. Towering gum trees planted during the park's dedication provided broad, dappled shade across lush lawns, stone paths, and wooden benches. Children played freely across the open grass, while local residents gathered every morning and afternoon to converse, read, and enjoy the open air. Every physical marker of the killer's domestic disguise had been thoroughly eradicated, replaced by an environment dedicated explicitly to community, vitality, and open light. What had once been a locus of hidden fear was now a permanent center of life and renewal. At the coastal sanctuary perched high on the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, overlooking the vast, sunlit expanse of the ocean, the granite memorial monument remained a luminous, quiet beacon under the sky. On its polished surfaces, the carved names of the young women whose identities and dignity were restored between 1978 and 1991 shone with breathtaking clarity. Visitors from every corner of the world, students, scholars, travelers, and descendants of the families who had carried the heavy burden of loss across 4 decades, paused at the cliff edge to pay silent respect. Their names were no longer spoken with the heavy ache of unresolved tragedy or fear, but with profound honor and enduring pride. They stood as eternal symbols of a society that had refused to surrender its lost citizens to obscurity, fighting across decades to ensure their truth was brought fully into the light. In the climate-controlled vaults of the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy at Lidcombe, the original glass vial containing Exhibit 1991, SF-88 remained preserved within its secure display. It sat not as a monument to horror, but as a sacred artifact of human foresight, discipline, and scientific persistence. It served as a constant, quiet reminder to every incoming generation of forensic scientists, pathologists, and investigators that physical reality retains a perfect, indelible memory of every action, and that human dedication, guided by truth, will always possess the power to shatter the deepest dark. The multi-decade arc of the Sydney serial case had reached its ultimate, unbroken conclusion. The Phantom was gone. His secrets were laid bare to the sun, his legacy was reduced to dust, and the memory of those he sought to erase was enshrined in light forever. Across the wide sky and rolling ocean of New South Wales, the sun rose over a world where justice was no longer a fragile, uncertain hope, but an absolute, eternal promise. As the 21st century matured into its second half, the narrative of Exhibit 1991 SF-88 was no longer treated merely as a famous criminal investigation or a milestone in technological evolution. It had become a foundational pillar of human civilization's collective philosophy regarding justice, memory, and the inviolable worth of the individual. The multi-decade saga, stretching from the cold, rain-soaked streets of 1991 Sydney to the transformative breakthroughs of 2026 and far beyond into an era of quiet remembrance, had achieved a complete, unshakable finality. The technological and investigative protocols forged in the crucible of the Sydney investigation, known universally as the 1991 Protocol, had long since become the standard operating procedure for global law enforcement. By harmonizing high-density single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, profiling, advanced spatial behavioral heat mapping, and automated genealogical triangulation under rigorous legal and constitutional safeguards, the system effectively eliminated the concept of an unsolvable crime across the world. Historical cold case vaults across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa had been systematically cleared of their long-standing shadows. Millions of digitized case files spanning a century were continuously cross-referenced against global databases. Thousands of unidentified remains were returned to their ancestral lineages, and the historic impunity once enjoyed by predators who counted on geographical dispersion, structural concealment, and the erosion of time was permanently eradicated. In New South Wales, the physical landscapes where the Midnight Phantom had once buried his dark secrets remained completely restored by nature, time, and human care. Along the wave-swept sandstone shelves of Colcliffe, where hidden concrete vaults had once been uncovered beneath the rocks, the Pacific Ocean maintained its eternal, soothing rhythm. The salt spray swept across clean rock faces where no trace of human malice remained. High in the Blue Mountains, thick forests of blue gums and mountain ash soared above the old limestone quarry, burying all remnants of past excavation beneath deep carpets of native ferns and wild moss. In the Royal National Park, coastal heathlands bloomed in vibrant seasonal cycles of gold, crimson, and white, welcoming bushwalkers and families navigating the ocean trails in total safety. The natural world had fully reclaimed every site, erasing all physical scars and leaving behind only the untamed, majestic beauty of the Australian environment. In the suburban community of Campbelltown, the public memorial park created on the demolished site of the offender's former residence had grown into a mature, cherished urban sanctuary. Towering gum trees provided broad, dappled shade across lush lawns, stone paths, and wooden benches. Children played freely across the open grass, while local residents gathered every morning and afternoon to converse, read, and enjoy the open air. Every physical and psychological marker of the killer's domestic disguise had been thoroughly eradicated, replaced by an environment dedicated explicitly to community, vitality, and open light. What had once been a dark locus of hidden terror was now a permanent center of neighborhood life, completely unburdened by the ghost that had once walked among them. At the coastal sanctuary perched high on the sandstone cliffs of Bondi, overlooking the vast, sunlit expanse of the ocean, the granite memorial monument remained a luminous, quiet beacon under the Australian sky. On its polished surfaces, the carved names of the young women whose identities and dignity were restored between 1978 and 1991 shone with breathtaking clarity. Visitors from every corner of the world, students, legal scholars, travelers, and the descendants of the families who had carried the heavy burden of loss across 4 decades, paused at the cliff edge to pay silent respect. Their names were no longer spoken with the heavy ache of unresolved tragedy or fear, but with profound honor and enduring pride. They stood as eternal symbols of a society that had refused to surrender its lost citizens to obscurity, fighting across decades to ensure their truth was brought fully into the light. In the climate-controlled vaults of the National Center for Advanced Forensic Genealogy at Lidcombe, the original glass vial containing Exhibit 1991 SF-88 remained preserved within its secure protective casing. It sat not as a monument to horror, but as a sacred artifact of human foresight, discipline, and scientific persistence. It served as a constant, quiet reminder to every incoming generation of forensic scientists, pathologists, and investigators that physical reality retains a perfect, indelible memory of every action, and that human dedication, guided by truth, will always possess the power to shatter the deepest dark. The multi-decade arc of the Sydney serial case had reached its ultimate, unbroken conclusion. The Phantom was gone, his secrets were laid bare to the sun, his legacy was reduced to dust, and the memory of those he sought to erase was enshrined in light forever. Across the wide sky and rolling ocean of New South Wales, the sun rose over a world where justice was no longer a fragile, uncertain hope, but an absolute, eternal promise. Part 26. The Unshakable Dawn of Truth. As the narrative of Exhibit 1991, SF-88 reverberated into the deeper reaches of the 21st century, its significance extended far beyond the boundary lines of criminal law, establishing an unshakable benchmark for human ethics, historical memory, and moral accountability. What had once begun as a cold, stalled case file in the damp rain of 1991 Sydney, a microscopic biological trace preserved in a glass vial, had completed its transformation into an eternal symbol of truth breaking through the thickest darkness. The global paradigm birthed by the Sydney investigation, known across international law enforcement as the 1991 Protocol, had matured into an automated, ubiquitous standard. By harmonizing high-density single nucleotide polymorphism, (SNP), genomic profiling, spatial behavioral predictive mapping, and multi-generational genealogical triangulation under strict, constitutional oversight, the legal framework ensured that the concept of untraceable impunity was completely eradicated. Across the world, historic archives were systematically purged of their shadows. Unidentified remains that had lain in anonymous plots for half a century were continuously matched to surviving family lineages, restoring names, dignity, and closure to thousands of families across every continent. In New South Wales, the physical landscapes where the Midnight Phantom had once buried his secrets remained fully reclaimed by time, nature, and human care. Along the wave-swept sandstone shelves of Colcliffe, where hidden concrete vaults had once concealed stolen relics of crime, the Pacific Ocean maintained its eternal, soothing wash. The salt spray swept across clean rock faces where no trace of malice remained. High in the Blue Mountains, thick stands of blue gums and mountain ash soared above the old limestone quarry, burying all remnants of past excavation beneath deep carpets of native ferns, wild moss, and fallen eucalyptus leaves. In the Royal National Park, coastal heathlands bloomed in vibrant seasonal cycles of gold, crimson, and white, welcoming bushwalkers and families navigating the ocean trails in complete tranquility. Nature had fully absorbed every scar, leaving behind only the untamed, majestic beauty of the Australian environment. In the suburban community of Campbelltown, the public memorial park created on the demolished site of the offender